Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity gets comfortable and the stranger corners of the world are explored slowly enough for the mind to loosen its grip on the day. Tonight, we're going somewhere most of us will never go, not because it is forbidden, not because it is hidden behind gates or guarded by anyone in particular, but because it lies so far below the surface of the Earth that even now, in this age of satellites, submarines and screens full of maps, it remains one of the least familiar places our species has ever tried to understand. We are going down into the deepest ocean trenches, into regions where sunlight does not reach, where pressure mounts like a great invisible weight, and where the imagination, perhaps quite reasonably, starts to do a little extra work. It is in these depths that strange things have always gathered, not only animals, though there are certainly enough of those to keep a biologist occupied for several lifetimes, but stories as well, rumours, sightings, half-glimpsed forms, bodies washed ashore that do not seem to fit neatly into the drawers we have prepared for the natural world, shapes reported by sailors, fishers, divers, monks, villagers, hunters, and the occasional person who may or may not have been having a very unusual day at sea. Across centuries and across cultures, people have looked toward deep water and said, in one way or another, there is something down there. Perhaps not always the same something, and perhaps not always described with great precision, but something unusual enough to resist easy explanation. That does not mean every tale is true in the literal sense, of course. Humans are very talented at misidentifying things, especially when the lighting is poor, the weather is unhelpful, and the witness is bobbing up and down in a wooden vessel while trying not to be sick. A decaying carcass can become a monster. A giant fish seen briefly can become a legend. A cultural memory can attach itself to a current, a reef, a trench, a patch of dark water, until the place itself feels inhabited. And yet, for all that, the pattern remains oddly persistent. Different names, different eras, different coastlines, the same uneasy gesture toward the unknown below. Maybe you have felt that unease yourself at some point, even if you've never set foot on a boat. Perhaps it came while staring at a photograph of the open ocean, the kind where the water looks almost black beneath a grey sky. Perhaps it arrived while swimming somewhere deeper than expected, when the floor dropped away and your mind, uninvited, began offering suggestions. There is a particular discomfort in not knowing what is beneath you. On land, even in darkness, we assume there is ground, a wall, a tree, a road, something fixed. In deep water, there is volume, there is distance, there is room for movement in every direction, and that alone is enough to make a sensible person suddenly think of teeth. Before we drift further into tonight's subject, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and whether it's late where you are. Maybe it's just after midnight and the house has finally gone quiet. Maybe rain is tapping at the windows. Maybe you're listening from a coastline not far from deep water yourself, which would be especially fitting, though perhaps a little unsettling. There is something very appropriate about talking about ocean trenches while the rest of the world is asleep, because both sleep and the deep sea have a way of loosening the neat outlines of things. Familiar categories start to blur, certainty becomes less rigid. A coat on a chair becomes a figure in the corner, a shadow in the water becomes something with intent. And if you find this journey soothing, or interesting, or simply a pleasant way to let the evening slow down, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed as well. It helps this quiet little corner reach others who might enjoy a slower walk through strange ideas, improbable creatures, and the parts of the world that still resist being tidied away. Not everything mysterious has to be loud. Some mysteries are best approached the way one approaches a dark shoreline at dusk, carefully, curiously, and with enough respect to keep one's shoes dry. Now, I should say from the start that tonight is not a hunt for one single beast with one final name and one dramatic reveal. It would be wonderfully convenient if the oceans worked like detective novels, with all clues leading neatly to one culprit waiting in the last few pages. The sea rarely offers that kind of courtesy. Instead, what we have is a long, tangled record of encounters and claims. Some are biological puzzles. Some are folkloric beings embedded in the memory of a people and a place. Some are stories that seem to have grown in the retelling, as stories do when given enough salt air and enough generations. Some are modern reports wrapped in the language of military secrecy, scientific uncertainty, or sensational headlines. And some sit in an uncomfortable middle ground, too odd to dismiss entirely, too thinly evidenced to accept with confidence. That middle ground is where the deep ocean does much of its best work. It is a region that produces uncertainty the way forests produce leaves. The sea keeps fragments, distorts scale, alters bodies after death, and conceals living things so thoroughly that their first appearance to science can feel less like a discovery and more like an interruption. Imagine spending centuries believing that a certain animal could not possibly exist because no one had seen it properly, only to have one hauled up from the dark looking as though it had arrived from a draft version of the planet. This has happened more than once. The ocean is quite rude that way. It lets us feel informed, then drops some translucent ribbon of muscle or some lamp-eyed thing with impossible jaws into a net, and reminds us that our catalogue is not the territory. This is especially true in the trenches, those long, narrow depressions in the seafloor that plunge down into extraordinary depth. They are not empty cracks waiting dramatically for a monster to rise out of them, though cinema has not been shy about suggesting otherwise. They are real geological structures formed where tectonic plates meet and shift and sink. Some lie deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Some are so difficult to explore that we have better maps of certain distant planets and moons than we do of the terrain at the bottom of our own oceans. That comparison gets used rather often, perhaps because it is both true and annoyingly humbling. We like to imagine ourselves as a species that has things broadly under control, but then a trench quietly exists several miles down, largely unbothered by our confidence. The conditions there are extreme in a way that is hard to feel from the comfort of a bed or sofa. There is no sunlight. Temperatures hover near freezing. Pressure becomes immense. Food is scarce and arrives irregularly, drifting down from above in bits and bodies, and marine snowfall. Creatures that live in such places do not evolve to impress tourists. They evolve to persist. They become soft where softness is useful, enormous where enormity helps, transparent where transparency costs less, bioluminescent where making one's own light is a better option than waiting for dawn that will never come. Some look delicate, some grotesque, some absurd, and some seem almost offended to have been seen at all. In a setting like that, it is not hard to understand why stories gather. Human beings have always used narrative to mark the edge of knowledge. Where we know the terrain, we name species, draw maps, establish routes, and complain about parking. Where we do not know the terrain, we begin to tell stories. Sometimes those stories are warnings dressed as monsters. Do not swim there. Do not fish there at the wrong season. Do not ignore the currents, the reefs, the weather, the sacred places, the places where people vanished before you. Sometimes a creature in lore is not simply a creature. It is a memory system. It is how danger becomes memorable enough to survive being passed from one generation to the next. At other times, though, something more awkward may be happening. A real animal is seen under bad conditions. A carcass is found in a state of collapse and transformation. A known species appears at an unfamiliar size or in an unusual developmental stage. A cultural image attaches itself to an unexplained event. A witness tries to describe something outside their usual experience, and the description comes out bent, stitched together from whatever comparisons are available. The result may sound mythic without having begun that way. There is a strange fairness to this. The ocean is not obliged to present its residents in textbook condition. Consider how often the sea hands us only parts of a puzzle. A glimpse of a back, a tail in rough weather, flesh altered by decay, a body so damaged that its ordinary features have softened into suggestions. One reason marine mysteries thrive is that the ocean is an expert at decomposition with style. When large animals die in salt water, tissues change, detach, bloat, collapse, and distort. Bones emerge in misleading arrangements. Cartilage persists where one would not expect it. Features that once made perfect sense in life can become fantastically misleading in death. A shark loses parts of its head and suddenly resembles some relic from a much older world. A giant ribbon-like larva looks less like a juvenile stage of anything and more like a message from biology saying, "If you thought you understood development, perhaps sit down." It is this blend of distortion and revelation that makes the deep sea such fertile ground for recurring mystery. Again and again, people meet something they cannot comfortably place. Sometimes science catches up and explains it. Sometimes it explains most of it. Sometimes the explanation is plausible and incomplete, which is a very scientific outcome and a very unsatisfying one if you are hoping for certainty before bed. Still, uncertainty has its own charm. It invites patience. It invites a slower kind of thinking. And when the subject is the ocean, patience is only fair. The sea has had a long time to become itself. It need not explain everything to us in one evening. What makes this especially fascinating is that the stories do not belong to one tradition alone. They appear in widely separated places among peoples with very different worldviews and vocabularies. In one region, a deep water being may be a guardian, a warning, an ancestor, or a force attached to dangerous currents and sacred geography. In another, it may be recorded as a sea monster in a monk's best attempt at natural history, with all the confidence of a person who has seen something alarming and owns a quill. Elsewhere, it turns up in the modern age as an alleged military encounter, a fisherman's report, a recovered carcass, or an object lesson in how quickly newspapers can turn a puzzling specimen into a headline with teeth. Put all of these cases side by side, and a curious pattern emerges. The pattern is not that every tale describes the same creature wearing different cultural costumes. That would be too neat, and the world is not usually kind enough to provide that level of symmetry. The pattern is that the deepest and least familiar waters attract a repeated combination of fear, reverence, misidentification, discovery, and narrative elaboration. In other words, the deep does not just produce creatures, it produces conditions under which creatures, reports, myths, errors, and genuine anomalies become difficult to separate cleanly. The trench is not only a place in the ocean, it is a place where categories start to fray. That fraying has always bothered us. Humans like boundaries. Fish, mammal, myth, mistake, body, spirit, hoax, relic, lava, god, eel, shark, folklore, evidence. We are much happier when each thing goes obediently into its proper box. The sea has other habits. It offers transitional forms, misleading remains, juvenile stages that look nothing like adults, and traditions in which the useful distinction is not between real and unreal, but between respectful and careless, known and unknown, safe and dangerous. There is wisdom in that older arrangement. A creature does not need to satisfy a modern, taxonomic standard to matter in human life. If a story keeps people alive near difficult water, it has done a kind of work no less real for being symbolic. And yet symbols do not cancel biology. That is another reason tonight's subject remains so intriguing. There really are animals in the ocean that seem, on first encounter, almost offensively improbable. Transparent heads, hinged jaws large enough to swallow prey nearly their own size, bodies that glow, pulse, vanish, or stretch into forms that appear unfinished. Giant squid were once treated as sailors' exaggerations until the evidence became too stubborn to ignore. Oarfish, with their length and silver bodies and startling faces, still look like something halfway between a prophecy and a plumbing problem. Even the ordinary residents of deep water can appear mythological if brought suddenly into daylight. The trench does not need to invent monsters from nothing, it merely needs to be itself. So when a story rises from that darkness, what exactly are we dealing with? A misunderstood animal, a ritual being, a symbol of dangerous water, a damaged carcass that triggered prehistoric associations in the modern mind? A fraud. A memory of an extinct form preserved as folklore. A sensational report built on thin testimony. A real but poorly documented species. An encounter filtered through panic. A creature seen in an early life stage science rarely observes. A combination of several of these at once. That last option is not especially dramatic, but it may be the most honest. The ocean has room for layered explanations. Perhaps that is why it resists clean endings. There is also the simple fact that we have seen very little of it. People often say we know more about the surface of Mars than the seafloor of Earth, and while such comparisons can become a bit theatrical if repeated too often, the underlying point stands. Exploration of the deep sea is expensive, technically difficult, risky and limited. Much of what lives down there is encountered indirectly through trawls, remote cameras, sonar hints, baited instruments, and rare manned descents. A forest you can walk through offers one kind of knowledge. A darkness you can visit only briefly under pressure inside metal offers another. It is not surprising that our understanding remains patchy. It would be stranger if it did not. That patchiness leaves room not only for science, but for imagination, suspicion, and belief. It leaves room for the possibility that some tales are only tales, and also for the possibility that a few began with something stubbornly real. A witness may be wrong about what they saw without being wrong that they saw something. A tradition may encode danger in symbolic language without being reducible to fantasy. A specimen may be explained eventually without losing the fact that, for a time, it unsettled the boundary between known and unknown. Not every mystery ends in revelation. Sometimes it ends in a footnote that says, uncertain origin, probable identification, more evidence needed, which is the scientific equivalent of a shrug in a lab coat. Tonight, then, we will move carefully among these reports and beings and remains, not trying to force them into one answer too quickly. We will look at cases that have been treated as biological oddities, as folklore, as maritime legend, as controversy, as cautionary tale. We will consider why the deep ocean so reliably becomes a home for things that refuse easy naming, and we will keep in mind a possibility that is neither as tidy as skepticism nor as thrilling as certainty. The possibility is that what recurs across these different accounts is not one hidden species waiting dramatically in the trench, but one recurring human situation. We encounter the least known parts of the world, catch a fragment of something, and build from it the best understanding we can with the tools, fears, and stories available to us. Still, fragments matter. Enough fragments, over enough time, begin to form patterns. Not proof, perhaps. Not yet, but patterns. A body here, a legend there, a sighting elsewhere, a report dismissed too quickly, another believed too easily, all orbiting the same realm of pressure and darkness and imperfect observation. It may be that the deep ocean has been serving us the same lesson for centuries. Not that there is one monster below, but that our planet still contains regions where the unknown remains structurally normal. Places where mystery is not a temporary failure of data, but the default condition. And perhaps that is why these stories endure. Not simply because we enjoy being frightened by the thought of giant things in the dark, though we clearly do and with some enthusiasm. They endure because they remind us that the world is not finished. There are still environments on Earth that can return our gaze without surrendering themselves entirely. There are still trenches beneath the waves that hold their distance from us. There are still creatures, or reports of creatures, that stand at the edge of explanation and refuse to step fully into the light. The deep sea does not just contain unknowns. It preserves the feeling of unknownness itself, and that feeling is rarer than it used to be. So, settle in, loosen the day from your shoulders, and let the surface world drift a little farther away. We're going to begin where these mysteries often begin, not with one specific beast, but with the larger reason the deepest waters have always seemed so ready to produce them, why the ocean's most hidden places keep drawing stories to themselves, and why, whenever people speak of something lurking far below, the idea never sounds entirely out of place. There is a very practical reason the deep ocean has always produced legends, and it is not because ancient people were especially gullible, nor because modern people are especially rational. It is because the sea, particularly the deep sea, is one of the few places on Earth where ordinary observation breaks down so quickly that the mind has to start filling in gaps. On land, if you hear something strange in the bushes, you can often walk over and check, though common sense may advise otherwise. In shallow water, you may not like what brushes your ankle, but at least there is usually a bottom, some light, and the vague confidence that whatever is nearby belongs to a familiar category, such as fish, weed, rock, or that one friend who thought it would be funny to grab your leg. In the deep ocean, none of those comforts apply. Depth removes context. Darkness removes scale. Water distorts sound and sight. Distance becomes difficult to judge. Motion becomes difficult to interpret. And when human beings are faced with something moving in a place they cannot easily understand, stories arrive almost as naturally as breath. That pattern is older than written history. Long before charts and compasses and sonar and submersibles, people lived beside coasts, crossed channels, followed currents, fished in dangerous waters, and watched what the sea chose to throw back. They knew very well that the ocean gave food, trade, weather and movement, but they also knew it could take all of those things away with insulting speed. A calm surface could become violent in an afternoon. A familiar shoreline could vanish in fog. A capable swimmer could disappear without spectacle. A boat could return half broken or not at all. When a place feeds you and threatens you in equal measure, you do not treat it as empty. You people it. You name its moods. You tell stories about what lives there, not because you are careless with reality, but because reality already feels inhabited. This is one reason sea legends so often serve more than one purpose at once. To modern ears, a story about a creature in deep water can sound like entertainment, or superstition, or a misunderstanding fossilized into folklore. Sometimes it is one of those things. Often it is several. But many such stories also functioned as practical maps of danger. A being said to dwell in a particular inlet, trench or current could mark a place where boats were lost, where undertows were strong, where the seafloor dropped abruptly, where storms gathered, or where respect was expected. Tell a child, the current there is unstable and may pull you beneath, and you may or may not be obeyed. Tell the same child, something lives there and it does not like the careless, and the message tends to survive much longer. Myth, in that sense, is not always the opposite of knowledge. Sometimes it is knowledge made memorable. The deep ocean in particular encourages this sort of thinking because it is full of consequences without visible causes. A person on a coast can see a wave break, but not always the underwater geography shaping it. A fisher can feel a line yanked downward without knowing what mouth took the bait. A diver can notice a sudden cold patch, a current change, a shadow where no shadow ought to be, and never learn exactly why. The human brain dislikes missing causes. We are built to connect effects to agents. Something moved, something made that noise, something caused that disappearance. This tendency is extremely useful when the something is a predator in the grass or a child pulling plates off a shelf. It becomes more complicated when the environment is a dark body of water, large enough to swallow cities and discreet enough never to explain itself. Then there is the matter of scale. The sea is full of animals that are hard to size correctly even in decent conditions. A body seen from below can appear enormous. A fin breaking the surface may suggest a far larger animal beneath. A long shape moving through waves can seem to continue much farther than it does. Anyone who has ever tried to estimate the size of a fish after it got away will understand that marine biology and optimism have a long shared history. Add poor weather, fear, distance, and the possibility that what is being seen is only one part of an animal, and you have ideal conditions for a legend to begin. A perfectly real creature can become something else simply because the observer never got the courtesy of a clear second look. Carcasses have played their own quiet but important role in this process. The sea has a talent for altering bodies in ways that are deeply unhelpful to identification. A dead shark can lose its lower jaw and fins and wind up looking far less like a shark than a person might reasonably expect. A decomposing whale can bloat, shed tissue, expose bone, and become an object that appears assembled by committee. Skin slips, cartilage persists. Hair-like tissue forms as connective fibres separate. Internal gases change shape. If that body then washes ashore after a storm, half rotted and twisted, the local population is not being foolish by finding it strange. It is strange. The ocean has already collaborated in making it so. One might even say it has a flair for posthumous mischief. Before scientific institutions were in a position to compare specimens systematically, many such remains could only be judged by eye, memory, and whatever natural knowledge a community already possessed. If a body did not resemble local fish, seals, whales, or sharks, the range of explanations widened immediately. Perhaps it was a monster. Perhaps it was a sign. Perhaps it was a rare being from farther out. Perhaps it belonged to an old story already waiting nearby, ready to receive new evidence. This is another reason legends gather around the deep rather than around, say, a familiar riverbank. The deep sends back incomplete messages. If the land is a place of tracks and trails, the deep ocean is a place of fragments. And yet the legends are not only built from misunderstanding. Some are built from perfectly reasonable observation of animals that really are odd enough to seem invented. The longer human beings spent going to sea, the more they encountered creatures that did not behave like the tidy examples shown in books or carved on temple walls. Giant squid, for instance, occupied an awkward territory for a long time. Sailors described enormous tentacled beings. Parts washed ashore. Scars on whales hinted at battles in the dark. For many listeners, this sounded exactly like the sort of story sailors might tell after too many weeks at sea and too little fresh fruit. Then, gradually evidence thickened. The implausible creature became a documented one. It did not become less strange because science accepted it. It merely became a strange thing with paperwork. That change from legend to zoological fact is worth pausing over because it tells us something important. A report can sound extravagant and still point toward reality. Not every extravagant report does, of course. If that were true, the oceans would now be densely populated with serpents, monks, horsefish, prophetic eels, and whatever else someone once saw during poor weather and strong conviction. But the existence of even a few once dismissed creatures means coastal traditions, and witness accounts cannot be waved away automatically. They must be handled carefully, neither swallowed whole nor discarded with theatrical skepticism. The ocean has embarrassed both credulity and arrogance often enough to keep everyone modest. Pressure also matters, though not only in the physical sense. Life at sea has always carried social and emotional pressure. Sailing crews lived in tight quarters, on uncertain schedules, under difficult conditions, exposed to fatigue, injury, monotony, fear, and weather. Fishers and hunters worked environments where a small error could prove fatal. Islanders and coastal peoples often depended on the sea in ways inland populations did not. Under such conditions, attention sharpens around anomalies. Anything unusual at sea feels heavier than the same thing on land. A strange bird may be remarked upon. A strange object or creature near a boat may be remembered for generations. The sea encourages significance. It makes events feel charged because consequences are never far away. Night intensified this further. Modern people, even those who enjoy camping and speaking grandly about simplicity, rarely spend extended time in true darkness over open water. Before electric lights, the sea at night was a different order of experience. The horizon disappeared. The sky merged with water, distances became guesses. Sound carried strangely. Bioluminescence could make the wake glow or the surface flash. Creatures surfacing briefly could appear lit from within or outlined in a way that turned them into something more dramatic than they might have looked at noon. Even now, if one sees a large animal move beneath dark water at night, one's first response is unlikely to be, "How nice," probably a documented species behaving within expected parameters. One tends instead toward language involving urgency. Bioluminescence alone must have contributed heavily to older sea legends. Imagine knowing nothing of luciferin or marine chemistry, and seeing patches of water ignite with blue-green light, or watching the outline of a swimming form appear suddenly luminous in your wake. To the modern mind, explained phenomena often lose none of their strangeness. They simply acquire terminology. To earlier observers, such things could easily suggest spirits, omens, or unusual beings, not because these people were irrational, but because the event itself was astonishing and demanded placement within an existing worldview. Every culture has to sort the extraordinary somehow. The deep sea supplies extraordinary material at a very steady rate. There is also a geographical reason legends persist in the ocean's deeper reaches. The deep lies just beyond the edge of regular access. It is not distant in the way a remote desert or mountain range might be. It is often close, physically, to everyday human life. A village may sit near a trench. A harbour may open onto water that falls away quickly into great depth. Fishers can pass above profound drop-offs without seeing them. The unknown is not always somewhere far away. Sometimes it begins a short journey from shore, under ordinary water, beneath routes used for work, prayer, trade, and homecoming. This closeness gives sea legends a special intensity. The unknown is not only remote, it is adjacent. That adjacency makes the deep especially good at collecting both reverence and fear. Many cultures did not frame water beings merely as monsters to be defeated. Some were guardians, ancestors, punishers of disrespect, or embodiments of places that required proper conduct. This is easy to misunderstand if one approaches all traditions expecting either literal zoology or pure invention. A being associated with a trench or dangerous current can be spiritually meaningful, morally instructive, and environmentally observant all at once. The modern habit of asking, "But was it real?" may miss the point if real is narrowed too quickly. A thing can be real as a force in communal life even when its exact physical form is not fixed like a specimen in a jar. At the same time, some of these traditions may preserve observations that were once much more concrete. A recurring association between a place and an unusual animal may begin with repeated encounters. Over time, those encounters accumulate ritual meaning. Details shift. The being grows in narrative importance. It acquires behaviours or powers matching the values and fears of the people telling the story. By the time a later outsider records it, the creature may sound entirely mythological, when in fact the earliest layer of the tradition may have been rooted in something materially observed. This layering is common in human storytelling generally. It would be surprising if the sea, with all its opportunities for partial evidence and repeated hazard, did not produce it constantly. The deep ocean also breeds legends because it resists demonstration. If a strange animal is reported in a forest, one might organise a search, inspect tracks, set cameras, question witnesses, and revisit the location. In the deep sea, the logistics become much more awkward. The environment itself keeps secrets. Even if a witness is sincere and precise, the chance of returning to the exact place under the same conditions and finding the same animal again may be very small. This makes dispute difficult to resolve. Skeptics remain unconvinced. Believers remain certain. The thing sinks back into narrative, where it can survive much longer than many better documented animals. Ironically, what cannot easily be proven can become culturally immortal. Some of the most stubborn sea legends also persist because the ocean really does contain animals that change drastically across life stages. This is a point that deserves more appreciation than it usually gets, because it makes older reports look less absurd. Many marine creatures begin life looking almost nothing like their adult forms. Larval eels, for example, can appear as transparent ribbons, delicate and uncanny. Juvenile stages of various deep-sea organisms can be so unlike the mature animal that, historically, they were catalogued separately. A witness seeing one such form without broader biological context might describe it as a unique creature, and they would not be entirely wrong. It was unique in appearance, in timing, and in the narrow window in which it could be encountered. The sea is full of temporary bodies. Then there are the animals that seem to belong to older ages. Coelacanths were believed extinct for tens of millions of years before living specimens were found. Goblin sharks look like what would happen if a committee were instructed to design a fish for the phrase, "best seen only once." Frilled sharks appear as though they missed several evolutionary meetings and kept going regardless. Sleeper sharks, giant isopods, fang-toothed fish, and all manner of gelatinous or elongated beings live in ways that remind us our sense of what is normal is badly biased toward life near the surface and conveniently lit. If a culture develops stories about strange deep-water creatures, the ocean has certainly provided enough raw material to keep the tradition supplied. Another feature of the deep is silence, or at least the human experience of it. Sound moves very efficiently through water, but human beings in boats or on coasts often encounter the sea as a place where causes remain acoustically detached from what they produce. Something strikes the hull, something splashes beyond sight, something large displaces water in darkness. The witness hears evidence of presence without having visual confirmation. This can be more unsettling than a direct sighting. Once the mind is given only noise and implication, it begins constructing actors, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. Either way, the event becomes a story because stories are how we stabilize experience after the fact. Isolation helped, so did repetition. A mariner who saw something strange once might doubt himself. A crew who all saw something odd and talked about it for years gave the event permanence. A village with several incidents tied to one stretch of coast would not need to choose between fear and tradition. The two could reinforce each other. And once a region became known for a certain being, later ambiguous events would tend to be interpreted through that existing frame. That is not evidence of dishonesty. It is how human perception works. We use available patterns to classify new events. If a culture already has a water being associated with dangerous surf, then an unexplained disturbance near that surf is likely to be understood within that pattern. Scientific communities do much the same, only with Latin names and fewer chants. It is also important to remember that legends survive because they are enjoyable to tell. Not all sea stories are solemn warnings or coded observations. Some are simply compelling. They entertain. They create shared language. They make an evening memorable. A person who has no interest in plate tectonics will still listen if you say something large was seen where the seafloor drops away. There is nothing trivial about this. The pleasure of telling a story is one of the engines that keeps memory alive. If the deep ocean has always bred legends, part of the reason is that it gives excellent material to narrators. It offers danger, ambiguity, weather, darkness, strange remains, and witnesses who are already primed to sound dramatic because they were, in fairness, having a dramatic time. By the time natural history emerged as a more formal way of sorting creatures, older sea legends did not vanish. They simply began sharing territory with reports, sketches, specimens, and later photographs. This did not end the confusion. In some cases, it intensified it. A half-decomposed body could now be presented not only as a local marvel, but as a scientific puzzle. Newspapers could spread sightings widely. Illustrators could add confidence where evidence lacked detail. A strange carcass could become an international sensation before any specialist had seen it. Modernity did not remove the sea's ability to generate legends. It gave the legends better distribution and occasionally a caption. Which brings us to the deepest waters themselves. Trenches and abyssal zones gather mystery not merely because they are deep, but because they are among the few environments where even modern science still works with frustratingly incomplete coverage. New species continue to be found. Known species continue to surprise researchers with unexpected ranges, sizes, behaviours, and appearances. The seafloor remains only partly mapped at high resolution. Carrion falls can draw assemblages of animals rarely seen otherwise. Camera systems reveal things briefly and then lose them. Nets haul up forms too damaged to understand fully. Each of these facts keeps the door open a little. Not open wide enough for every monster ever imagined, but open enough to make certainty look premature. So the deep ocean has always bred legends for several solid reasons. It is dangerous. It is dark. It alters bodies. It distorts senses. It contains real animals that look improbable. It sits close to human life while remaining largely inaccessible. It punishes overconfidence and rewards memory. It invites cultural meaning. It resists verification. It gives back fragments. And when people receive fragments from a powerful half-seen world that can kill them, feed them, and disappear their evidence, they do what people have always done. They build stories sturdy enough to carry warning, wonder, and uncertainty all at once. That habit has not gone away. It has merely changed clothes. Today the language may be cryptids, anomalies, classified encounters, viral footage, disputed carcasses, and deep-sea mysteries. Earlier it may have been guardians, omens, spirits, sea saints gone wrong, or beings that punish the careless. The structure underneath remains familiar. Something is glimpsed. Something is found. Something is said to dwell below. The evidence is partial. The setting is difficult, and the report lingers because neither dismissal nor belief quite settles it. And once that pattern is in place, it becomes easier to understand why certain specific cases keep resurfacing whenever people talk about strange things from the deep. Some of them come from folklore, some from ships and nets, some from carcasses that looked wrong in ways biology can eventually explain, and some from forms so unfamiliar that even an explanation does not make them feel ordinary. One of the clearest examples is not a monster in the usual sense at all, but a life stage, a shape so peculiar and oversized that it seemed to point toward an unknown giant in the sea, a long translucent riddle that helps show how very little the deep needs to do before human beings begin wondering what on earth, or rather under it, they are really looking at. One of the reasons the ocean has always been so effective at unsettling human certainty is that it does not simply hide creatures from us. It also hides what stage of life they are in, what they are becoming, and whether the form we are seeing is the one we ought to be using to identify them at all. On land, most animals are kind enough to look broadly related to themselves as they grow. A deer becomes a larger deer. A fox becomes a larger fox. Even when the young are small, clumsy, or faintly ridiculous, no one mistakes a fawn for an unknown forest spirit or a juvenile badger for evidence that mammals have been assembled incorrectly. In the sea, matters are far less tidy. Marine life has a habit of beginning as one thing, appearing for a while to be another, and only later resolving into the form that makes the textbooks feel calm again. This is where the giant leptocephalus enters the story, and with it one of the most useful lessons the ocean can offer anyone interested in monsters, mysteries, or the many errors produced by trying to identify a living thing before it has finished becoming itself. The word leptocephalus does not sound particularly dramatic. It has the faintly administrative quality of something that might be stamped on a drawer in a museum basement, yet the creatures it refers to are among the more quietly uncanny forms in marine biology. A leptocephalus is the larval stage of certain eel-like fish, especially true eels. These larvae are often transparent or nearly so, ribbon-like, leaf-shaped, delicate, and profoundly unlike the muscular, slippery adult animals they will one day become. To encounter one without context is to experience a small but meaningful betrayal by nature. It does not look like a baby eel. It looks like an idea the sea had before settling on the final version. For a long time, That mismatch caused considerable confusion. Scientists once classified leptocephalae as entirely separate species because the difference between larva and adult was so extreme. That was not stupidity. It was a very human response to a very unreasonable body plan. If you were handed a translucent, flattened, drifting ribbon with a tiny head and almost ghost-like anatomy, you would not naturally conclude that it was on its way to becoming a robust adult eel lurking in mud or reef or river mouth. You would conclude, very fairly, that the ocean had given you a different animal altogether. This happened repeatedly because marine development is not always concerned with looking sensible to observers. The giant leptocephalus complicated matters further. Ordinary leptocephalae are already strange enough. Enlarge the form, stretch it farther into that leaf-like transparency, and you get something that seems to belong less to the well-mapped world of fisheries and more to the category of things sailors ought to mention in low voices. Reports of unusually large eel larvae prompted speculation that there must exist correspondingly gigantic adult eels somewhere in the sea. The logic was simple, and in ordinary circumstances quite sound. If this is a juvenile, then the adult must be larger still. If the juvenile is already remarkably big, then what exactly is waiting at the end of its development? That line of thought has an immediate appeal because it turns a specimen into a promise. A giant larva suggests a giant unseen parent form. It transforms an oddity in a net into evidence that somewhere in deeper or more remote waters, a substantial adult continues to evade us. It is precisely the kind of idea that sits at the crossroads of biology and sea legend. Not a dragon, not a spirit, not even necessarily a monster. Just a very large, unknown animal implied by the existence of an unfinished one. It is a quieter kind of mystery, but perhaps an even more persuasive one because it begins with a real organism lying there in plain view. That is one reason the giant leptocephalus is so interesting in a larger discussion about recurring ocean mysteries. It shows how uncertainty can emerge not from fantasy, but from growth. The creature is real. The body is real. The developmental stage is real. The confusion enters because the body is a temporary one, and temporary forms can be deeply misleading when viewed without their future attached. The ocean does not always reveal a species in a neat sequence from egg to larva to juvenile to adult. Often it gives us one stage in isolation, as though handing over a single page torn from the middle of a book and expecting us to reconstruct the rest of the plot. There is something especially unnerving about unfinished creatures, because they challenge one of our basic expectations about identity. We like to think that an organism is itself in a stable and recognisable way. We are comfortable with growth. We are less comfortable with transformation. A caterpillar turning into a butterfly is already dramatic enough to support entire metaphors about change, destiny, and self-improvement. Yet even that familiar example has been tidied by repetition. We know it. We teach it to children. We accept it as a neat educational miracle. In the ocean, metamorphosis is often messier, less photogenic, and far more disruptive to classification. Animals drift through forms that seem disconnected from what comes later. The larval body is not simply a small version of the adult. It is an alternate strategy, a separate architecture, a temporary solution to a different set of environmental problems. Leptocephalae in particular are built for drifting life in the open ocean. Their transparency helps conceal them. Their flattened bodies offer a lot of surface area with relatively little mass. They are not little eels waiting politely in miniature. They are larvae adapted to a pelagic existence, often feeding and moving in ways that fit that early stage rather than the adult niche they will eventually occupy. When they metamorphose, they shrink, reorganize, and become recognizably eel-like. That process alone can feel almost intentionally misleading to anyone hoping the sea will keep its category stable. Imagine finding a giant transparent ribbon and being told that one day it will become something denser, darker, stronger, and much more familiar. It sounds less like biology and more like a trick. Historically, this trickery mattered. Before life cycles were understood in detail, strange juvenile forms opened the door to large speculation. If giant leptocephaly existed, what size were the adult eels? How deep did they live? Why were they so rarely seen? Did they remain in inaccessible waters? Did they grow to lengths beyond what anyone had documented? Were there vast eel-like creatures in the deep sea whose early stages drifted outward into waters where humans occasionally intercepted them? These are not foolish questions. They arise naturally from incomplete evidence. A great deal of natural history began in exactly this way, with a partial organism suggesting a larger hidden order. At times, the giant leptocephalus became a kind of placeholder for the unknown adult. Its size made it tempting to imagine great serpentine fish inhabiting the deep ocean beyond ordinary reach. There is a reason eel-like animals have always been good raw material for legend. Their bodies already resist the neat, four-cornered logic of terrestrial animals. They are long, flexible, smooth, hard to pin down visually, and capable of appearing suddenly out of murk in a way that seems designed to produce overstatement. Add developmental stages that look nothing like the adult, and you have an ideal recipe for persistent confusion. The larva implies something large. The adult, if observed at all, may not be recognized as connected to it. The gap between them fills itself with speculation. There is also the emotional effect of transparency. Transparent marine organisms often feel more alien than they deserve to. They are no more supernatural than a cod or a crab, but because we are accustomed to bodies that declare their boundaries clearly, a translucent animal seems to occupy an uncertain status between presence and absence. One can see through it and still not understand it. The giant leptocephalus, with its delicate body and visible internal structure, has exactly this quality. It looks incomplete, not only because it is a larva, but because transparency makes it seem unfinished even to the eye. It appears less like a final answer than a draft, and drafts make the imagination restless. This is not merely a visual issue. It goes deeper into how human beings infer meaning from form. When we see a creature with a strong, coherent outline, we assume purpose and completion. The body looks settled. A shark looks shark-like with great confidence. A tuna seems committed to being a tuna. A transparent ribbon with a tiny head and oddly insubstantial body seems unresolved. It appears to be in negotiation with itself. That appearance can lead us to read it as primitive, experimental, or somehow left over from another world, even when it is simply a perfectly good larva getting on with its day. The deep ocean supplies many such forms, and each one presses on the same weakness in human perception. We assume unfamiliar means ancient, monstrous, or unfinished. Sometimes only the last of those is true. The phrase unfinished creature may sound dramatic, but in the case of marine larvae it is almost practical. These are bodies on the way somewhere, yet the problem begins when we do not know where they are going. Without the adult form, the larval stage becomes a freestanding mystery. This happened with leptocephaly, and it has happened elsewhere in marine biology. Distinct life stages were historically named as separate species. Early naturalists did not always realize they were documenting different moments in one organism's development. Again, this is easy to mock only if one has the advantage of hindsight and a complete lab manual. The sea rarely gives complete manuals, it gives fragments, often in jars. The giant leptocephalus acquired its mystique because it seemed to suggest a hidden scale. Most mysteries of the deep trade on concealment. This one traded on implication. A big larva is not frightening because of what it is in the moment. It is unsettling because of what it suggests exists somewhere else. It is a clue pointing downward and forward at once. Downward, into less accessible waters where the adult might live. Forward, into a developmental future the witness cannot observe. That dual uncertainty is especially potent. One does not merely lack the whole animal, one lacks the whole timeline, and so the giant leptocephalus became a useful symbol of a larger marine problem. How often are we meeting creatures at the wrong moment, How often are unusual sightings not unknown species exactly, but known or knowable species intercepted at a stage most people never see? How many maritime monsters are really fragments of life cycles glimpsed sideways? The answer will vary from case to case, but it is enough to complicate the old binary between monster and mistake. Some reports are neither. They are encounters with genuine biological oddity, whose explanation depends on understanding transformation rather than static form. That distinction matters because the sea has always punished overconfidence in classification. We want fixed shapes, fixed names, and firm boundaries. The ocean presents shifting ontologies in gelatinous form. Consider how many deep-sea animals appear to dissolve the categories surface life taught us to trust. Some look like larvae even when adult. Some retain juvenile traits. Some undergo drastic metamorphosis. Some display males and females so different that one could imagine them belonging to unrelated lines. Anglerfish, for instance, have their own alarming way of reorganizing expectations. The giant leptocephalus belongs in that broader gallery of bodies that remind us nature is under no obligation to make identification intuitive. At the same time, it also invites a different sort of caution. Not every oversized or strange larval form points to an undiscovered giant lurking in abyssal darkness. Sometimes the adult is already known. Sometimes size estimates are exaggerated. Sometimes specimens are damaged, stretched, or mismeasured. Sometimes the excitement around the organism grows larger than the organism itself, which is a very human tradition not limited to fishing. But even when the grander speculations prove too ambitious, the core lesson remains. Marine life is much easier to misunderstand when encountered in transit between forms. The unknown can arise from development itself. There is something almost philosophical in that. We tend to think mystery belongs to what is hidden, but some mysteries belong to what is in the open and still not interpretable. An unfinished creature confronts us with visible uncertainty. It is right there. We can hold it, sketch it, preserve it, measure it, and still fail to place it correctly because we are missing the context of becoming. In that sense, the giant leptocephalus is a perfect deep-sea emblem. It is not wholly hidden. It is not wholly knowable. It is evidence without completion. It asks us to imagine a future body we cannot yet see. This quality also helps explain why stories of strange ocean entities have such staying power. Many are not based on clear encounters with adults in stable form. They are based on glimpses, damaged remains, juvenile stages, exceptional sizes, and conditions under which the organism seems somehow wrong for itself. That feeling of wrongness is powerful. A witness may not say, "I have observed a larval stage with atypical dimensions and uncertain taxonomic context." A witness says, in effect, "I saw something that did not look finished." That description may sound unscientific, but it captures something real about the encounter. The deep sea is full of organisms whose life histories make them appear incomplete, when in fact they are exactly where they should be. Even so, the imagination cannot resist enlarging the unknown adult behind the giant larva. This is where scientific uncertainty and folklore briefly shake hands. The possibility of massive eel-like animals in remote waters has long appealed to people because it feels almost reasonable. Eels are secretive. They travel. They emerge from holes and disappear into depths. For centuries, even their breeding habits were obscure enough to invite absurd theories. If any familiar creature were going to keep a parallel hidden life far from human view, the eel seemed a likely candidate. It is slippery in both body and meaning. The giant leptocephalus only deepened that aura by hinting, however ambiguously, that something larger and less seen might be out there. Modern biology has clarified much of this. We know far more about eel development than earlier observers did. We understand that leptocephali are larval forms, that their appearance can be startlingly unlike the adult, and that unusual specimens do not automatically imply a monster beyond the horizon. Yet explanation does not fully remove the fascination. In fact, it may sharpen it. Knowing that a delicate, transparent ribbon can transform into a muscular adult eel does not make the lava less strange. It makes life itself seem stranger. The explanation is not a disenchantment. It is a reminder that the ocean's ordinary processes are already odd enough to have generated centuries of wonder without any help from fiction. This is why the giant leptocephalus deserves its place in any discussion of deep ocean entities, not because it proves some giant hidden species beyond present science, though such possibilities have certainly tempted many people, but because it demonstrates how genuine marine biology creates the conditions for mystery. It sits at the hinge between evidence and interpretation. One can hold the lava in hand and still find one's thoughts pulled toward the unseen adult, the unknown depth, the incomplete life cycle, the sense that the sea keeps showing us pages before the binding arrives. It is a biological anomaly in one sense, but also a lesson in how anomalies form in the first place. And once you begin noticing unfinished creatures, you start seeing the problem everywhere. The ocean gives us juveniles that look ancient, adults that look larval, dead bodies that look fabricated, and growth stages so counterintuitive that even trained observers once sorted them incorrectly. The distance between unknown animal and known animal at an unfamiliar stage can be surprisingly narrow enough in fact to support entire schools of speculation, narrow enough to keep one cautious whenever a strange form rises from a trawl or appears in a photograph divorced from context, narrow enough that a witness may be both mistaken in conclusion and perfectly justified in astonishment. There is a certain humility in that realization. The deep does not always hide a monster. Sometimes it hides a life cycle. Sometimes it hides the adult form of a larva, or the larval history of an adult, and lets us build legends in the gap. We can laugh gently at older confusions if we like, but only up to a point. Had most of us encountered a giant leptocephalus without explanation, we would have done what humans have always done with the sea's more theatrical offerings. We would have stared at it, argued about it, assigned it a category too soon, and then told the story again with just enough emphasis to make it stick. That storytelling impulse becomes even stronger when the strange thing is not delicate and transparent, but heavy, damaged, and hauled from the water in a condition that seems to accuse the world of having hidden something prehistoric from us all along. A larval ribbon is one sort of puzzle, a carcass in a net is another, and once the ocean starts delivering bodies that look neither entirely mythical nor comfortably familiar, the trouble of identification deepens, because a living organism in an unfinished stage can already mislead us badly enough. But a dead one, altered by decay and pressure and the rude chemistry of seawater, can make even a very ordinary animal seem like the return of something the world was supposed to have left behind. There are few things more effective at restarting the sea monster conversation than a large dead body in a fishing net. A blurry sighting may come and go, a legend may be respectfully debated for centuries, a rumour can drift around ports like cigarette smoke and never quite settle. But a carcass is different. A carcass appears to offer proof. It has weight. It has texture. It can be photographed, measured, argued over, and dragged onto a deck while a group of tired men stand around it making the kind of faces people make when reality has become briefly uncooperative. And when that carcass looks old in the wrong way, when it seems to belong not merely to an unfamiliar species but to a much earlier version of the Earth, the effect is immediate. The ocean stops being mysterious in a distant philosophical sense and becomes mysterious in a very practical one. Something is here. Something has surfaced. Something smells terrible. And no one is entirely sure what it is. That is why the Zuyo Maru carcass remains one of the most famous examples of how the sea can turn uncertainty into spectacle. The case has all the elements needed for a durable marine mystery. There is a fishing vessel, there is an unexpected catch, there are photographs, there is disagreement, there is decay, which in sea mysteries is almost less a complication than a requirement. There is the faint but irresistible scent of prehistoric survival, and above all there is the shape of the thing, because shape is often where marine mysteries begin. Not evidence in the strictest sense, not anatomy properly understood, shape. the general outline of a body glimpsed under difficult conditions, or in this case hauled up in a state altered enough to make the eye start suggesting impossible ideas. In 1977, the Japanese trawler Zuyo Maru hauled up a strange carcass off the coast of New Zealand. By the time most people encountered the story, what mattered was not every technical detail of the retrieval, but the broad impression left by the body itself. It had a long neck-like structure, a small head, a large torso, and what appeared to be flipper-like limbs. In the photographs, the remains looked uncannily like the kind of extinct marine reptile schoolchildren are taught to recognise at once, usually with great excitement and very little nuance. The word plesiosaur began circulating almost immediately because of course it did. Human beings are nothing if not loyal to familiar dramatic templates. Present us with a decomposing marine body, whose proportions seem even vaguely prehistoric, and we will have 1 foot in the Mesozoic before the smell is cleared. Now, it is worth saying that the people involved were not behaving irrationally in the face of the thing. If a large carcass comes up from the sea looking unlike the whales, sharks, and ordinary fish, a working crew would expect. Uncertainty is the sensible response. The ocean has already done its part by rearranging the body. Death in seawater is not a dignified exit. It is a process of swelling, sloughing, collapsing, loosening, stretching, and revealing. Body parts do not remain faithfully instructional. Tissues decay at different rates. Cartilage persists where muscle fails. Limbs or fins may seem more prominent once surrounding structures are gone. The face, especially, is often a liar after death. It shrinks, caves, distorts, and withholds the features that would have made identification easy when the animal was alive. A carcass from the sea is very rarely a neat lesson in comparative anatomy. It is more like a practical joke delivered by chemistry. This is why so many marine carcass mysteries depend not on whether the body is real, but on which parts of the body are no longer honest. In the case of the Zuyo Maru remains, the strange profile triggered interpretations that quickly outpaced what the specimen could support. The photos were compelling because they seemed to show something with a long neck and a proportionally small head attached to a heavy body. That combination is almost engineered to invite prehistoric comparisons. The public imagination does not need much encouragement to leap from odd marine carcass to survival of an ancient lineage. It certainly did not in the late 20th century, and it still does not now. We have a lasting weakness for the possibility that somewhere the old world never fully ended, that a cold pocket of ocean or a deep trench has quietly kept one impossible resident on file. At the same time, scientists and analysts looking at the case approached it from a different direction. Rather than asking what extinct animal the carcass resembled in broad outline, they asked a more suspicious and less glamorous question. What known animal, altered by decomposition, could look like this? It is a very useful question, though it rarely gets the dramatic music. Marine mystery cases often look most convincing at the level of silhouette. Once one starts dissecting them into tissues, skeletal patterns, collagen fibres, and rates of decay, the romance tends to leak out. This can feel disappointing, but it is also where many of the best lessons live. The shape of a sea mystery is often produced not by the living body alone, but by what the sea has subtracted from it. One of the strongest explanations for the Zuyo Maru carcass has long been that it was the remains of a basking shark. This suggestion may sound underwhelming at first, especially if one has just spent a cheerful half-hour imagining a plesiosaur drifting up from the deep after millions of years of excellent hiding. A basking shark is not extinct. It is not a sea reptile. It is, on paper, a known species. Yet a decomposing basking shark is one of the ocean's great specialists in becoming something else. This is because of the way its body falls apart after death. The lower jaw and gill structures, which in life make sense as part of a large filter-feeding shark head, are among the first parts to be lost or collapse. Once those go, the remaining skull and vertebral column can produce the appearance of a narrow head on a long neck. The pectoral fins and pelvic structures can seem limb-like. The body loses the familiar shark profile and gains a falsely reptilian one. In other words, decay edits the animal into a lie with enough anatomical confidence to cause trouble. This is one of the most fascinating things about the Zuyo Maru case. It is not merely a question of mistaken identity, it is a case in which decomposition actively collaborates with imagination. The carcass did not just fail to look like a basking shark, it looked like the kind of thing people already wanted hidden in the deep. That is a stronger effect. If an altered body resembled a random and emotionally neutral unknown fish, there would be less fuss. But a long-necked carcass evokes a whole ready-made cultural library. Ancient monsters, lost worlds, survival stories, deep time leftovers. The sea did not merely present an anomaly, it presented an anomaly with branding. That branding matters more than one might think, because humans are very poor at encountering raw form without immediately narrating it. We do not see shape and stop there. We see shape and start matching. This resembles a serpent. That resembles a horse. This resembles an old fossil illustration from a museum book. Once the resemblance locks in, it becomes hard to unsee. A person who looks at the Zuyo Maru photos and sees a plesiosaur-like outline will tend to interpret every detail through that frame. The neck becomes more neck-like. The body becomes more reptilian. The missing context becomes evidence rather than absence. This is not dishonesty. It is perception doing what it does best and worst, which is building coherent stories from incomplete information. There is also the matter of timing and medium. The late 20th century was a perfect environment for such a mystery to spread. A striking photograph could circulate widely. News reports could simplify the case into something catchy and dramatic. Specialist caution could arrive later, softer and with far less charm than a headline involving a prehistoric creature. Once the idea entered public circulation, it became very difficult to retract emotionally, even if the technical evidence leaned elsewhere. That is another feature of sea mysteries worth noticing. The first strong image often matters more than the final careful explanation. The body that looked like a plesiosaur remains memorable. The explanation involving a decomposed shark, while probably more plausible, lacks the same theatrical posture. It is true enough to convince, but not colourful enough to dominate. Still, the scientific side of the story is not uninteresting. Far from it. It simply asks for a different kind of attention. Tissue samples from the carcass were examined. Analyses suggested protein patterns consistent with a shark rather than a reptile or mammal. Specialists in marine animals noted similarities to decomposed basking sharks, and over time that interpretation became the leading explanation among researchers. None of this means the initial excitement was foolish. It means the ocean had once again done what it does so well. It had produced a genuine puzzle, then offered just enough evidence to start a fight and not quite enough to make the fight elegant. That lack of elegance is part of what keeps the case alive. Sea mysteries survive not only because they are unresolved, but because they are resolved in ways that leave a little emotional resistance behind. A completely unknown animal would be one type of story. A complete and tidy identification would be another. The Zuyo Maru carcass lives in the narrower and more durable territory between them. The likely explanation is strong, but the image remains disobedient. The mind still returns to the photographs and thinks, yes, but look at it. It is one thing to understand decomposition in principle. It is another to confront a body that still seems, on visual impression, to have wandered in from a different age. That gap between visual impression and anatomical explanation tells us a great deal about how marine legends continue to form even in modern times. We often imagine that science and photography should have put an end to this sort of thing, as if cameras function like little machines for certainty. In practice, cameras preserve ambiguity just as efficiently as they preserve evidence. They freeze a moment, but they do not restore context. A photograph of a carcass cannot tell you what tissues have already been lost, what the body looked like fresh, how long it drifted, What parts are folded, stretched, damaged, or collapsed? It records shape, yes, but shape without history can be treacherous. The sea is very good at producing treacherous shapes, and shape, in these cases, is everything. A living animal often identifies itself through movement as much as form. The way a shark swims, a seal rolls, or an eel flexes can clarify what a blurry glimpse failed to show. A carcass has no such advantage. It lies there, reduced to posture and proportion, asking to be interpreted entirely by outlines. That is one reason dead bodies have contributed so much to sea monster lore over the centuries. They hold still long enough to be projected upon. A living creature vanishes too quickly. A carcass lingers. It invites scrutiny. It invites drawing. It invites headlines. It allows people to stand around it and say the sort of deeply unhelpful but historically productive things that lead directly to folklore. The Zuyo Maru case also reminds us that not all mystery depends on invention. The body itself was real. The confusion was real. The disagreement was real. The photographs were real. The sense of strangeness was entirely justified. In a way, that is more interesting than a hoax would have been. A fraud is simple. An authentic body that misleads through natural processes is far more instructive. It shows how nature can produce convincing false impressions without anyone needing to cheat. That is a far richer source of legend. Hoaxes date quickly. Misunderstandings rooted in real phenomena can endure for decades because they carry both evidence and doubt in the same frame. There is another layer to this. The case fed into a broader pattern of 20th century fascination with relict creatures, living fossils, and survivors from deep time. The ocean was and remains the ideal stage for such hopes, because it combines poor access with proven biological surprises. Coelacanths had already reminded the world that long-lost lineages might persist unexpectedly. Deep-sea fish looked old enough to satisfy any number of prehistoric fantasies. Giant squid had moved from story toward documentation. In that atmosphere, a strange carcass from the sea did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a culture already primed to wonder whether the deep might be storing leftovers from the planet's previous drafts. The Zuyo Maru body landed squarely in that emotional current. At the same time, the case is a warning against relying too heavily on resemblance. Resemblance is seductive because it feels immediate. This looks like that. The problem is that marine decay can produce convergences that are entirely misleading. Remove enough tissue from a shark and it can begin imitating a reptile. Distort enough structure in a whale carcass and it can seem vaguely serpentine or mammalian in the wrong way. A person looking at such remains is not really seeing a stable organism. They are seeing a temporary architecture produced by disassembly. It is the biological equivalent of walking into a half-renovated house and deciding you now understand the original blueprint better than the builders did. And yet, one cannot quite blame the public for loving the plesiosaur idea. It has all the ingredients of a very satisfying story. Something ancient, something hidden, something surfacing unexpectedly from depths we still do not know well. The notion flatters both fear and hope. Fear, because it suggests there are large things below us with long histories and no particular interest in our categories. Hope, because it suggests the world is less finished than we think. There is a childlike pleasure in imagining that the oceans still contain one impossible survivor, gliding patiently through trenches while our museums display its relatives as bones. Even the most skeptical mind can feel the pull of that image before returning, somewhat reluctantly, to collagen, analysis and shark anatomy. This tension between image and explanation is what gives the Zuyo Maru case its lasting place in deep-sea lore. It is not the strongest evidence for a prehistoric survivor, but it is one of the best examples of how the ocean manufactures persuasive uncertainty. A carcass comes up altered enough to look extraordinary. People see what the shape suggests. Experts propose a more ordinary but technically grounded explanation. The public remains half convinced that something has been explained away too quickly. The case never fully dies because neither side completely satisfies the other. One has the anatomy, the other has the photograph. And photographs, for all their limits, are very stubborn company. There is also a broader lesson here about the relationship between the unknown and the badly preserved. Many sea mysteries begin not with living monsters, but with damaged evidence. We tend to think the unknown should arrive in pristine form, like a new species in a glossy paper, with neat labels and a patient researcher pointing at useful bones. In reality, the unknown often arrives soggy, incomplete, and smelling so terrible that people would prefer not to keep it on deck any longer than necessary. Knowledge begins in unpleasant circumstances surprisingly often. The Zuyo Maru carcass belonged to that tradition. It was not a neat discovery. It was a difficult object in a state of transition between animal, evidence and story. And once a marine mystery becomes a story, it starts to do more than identify a body. It begins representing a whole kind of possibility. The Zuyo Maru carcass came to stand for the idea that the deep sea might still produce things science had not fully accounted for. That idea is not absurd. The deep sea does still produce surprises. New species continue to be found. Old assumptions continue to be corrected. The difficulty lies in drawing the line between genuine surprise and the persuasive theatre of decomposition. That line is rarely visible at first glance, which is why the case remains so useful. It teaches caution without removing wonder. It says in effect that the ocean can fool us honestly. Perhaps that's the most important phrase here. Honestly, the sea does not need to lie. It only needs to return a body in altered form and let us do the rest. The mystery arises not because reality is broken, but because reality in marine conditions is already strange enough to mimic impossible things. A decomposing basking shark can look like a sea reptile. A larval eel can look like the juvenile stage of a hidden giant. A cultural legend can align with a biological puzzle closely enough to make both seem stronger. The deep ocean does not produce clean categories. It produces overlap, and overlap is where legends breathe. So the Zuyo Maru carcass remains important not because it proved a plesiosaur survived into modern times, but because it showed exactly how a sea mystery takes shape. A real body, a misleading form, a dramatic resemblance, a burst of interpretation, a plausible explanation that cannot fully erase the image that came first. Once that pattern is recognized, it becomes easier to understand why certain places and traditions hold on to strange marine entities so firmly. The ocean does not have to hand people a complete monster. It only has to give them enough shape to begin attaching meaning to water that was already feared, respected or remembered for its dangers. And this is where the path leads naturally from carcasses to older traditions, because long before trawlers and tissue analysis, people living near dangerous waters were already attaching memory, warning, and presence to the places where the sea behaved badly. A strange body in a net is one way mystery arrives. Another is through a being said to dwell in a river mouth, a lake, a whirlpool, or a coastal passage, not merely as an animal to be identified, but as part of the living relationship between a people and the waters that shape their lives. Of all the beings said to dwell in dangerous waters, the Taniwha may be among the easiest to misunderstand if approached too quickly. That is partly because many people outside Aotearoa, New Zealand first encounter the word in the flattened language of headlines, tourism blurbs or retellings that treat it as if it simply means sea monster. It does not sit comfortably inside that box. In Maori tradition, Taniwha are supernatural beings whose forms and roles vary between tribal traditions. They are associated not only with the sea, but also with rivers, lakes, caves, and other powerful places in the landscape. Some are dangerous, some are protective, some are linked with specific people, places, or journeys. Some may appear in reptilian forms, while others may take shapes such as sharks, whales, octopuses, or even logs in the water. That variation matters, because the Taniwha is not one neatly standardized creature waiting to be sketched in a field guide. It belongs to a world in which place, ancestry, danger, protection and spiritual force are not separated as sharply as they often are in modern Western categories. Tiara's account notes that Taniwha, though supernatural, were understood within the Maori worldview as part of the natural environment, not something standing entirely outside it. That single point changes the tone of the whole discussion. It means that if one tries to read every account as either zoology or fantasy, one is already too late and probably standing in the wrong intellectual footwear. This is one of the reasons the Taniwha belongs so naturally in a discussion about the deepest and least understood waters. The being itself is important, certainly, but so is the way it reveals something about how human communities relate to places that are dangerous, life-giving, difficult to navigate, and impossible to control. In Maori thought, people are understood as deeply connected to land and nature, and that connection sits within wider ideas of guardianship, or kaitikitanga, along with concepts such as tapu and Maori. Kaitikitanga is described by Tiara as guardianship and protection, grounded in a worldview in which humans are part of the natural world rather than separate from it, and Maori is treated as a life force that must be protected in forests, rivers, gardens, lakes, and the sea. Once that framework is held in mind, the Taniwha stops looking like a simple monster story, and starts looking more like a sign that certain waters are socially, spiritually and physically charged. A deep channel, a rough crossing, a dangerous river bend, a place where currents behave badly or where carelessness has consequences. Such places do not remain blank in human life for very long. They gather memory, they gather caution, they gather names. A Taniwha attached to a place may therefore be many things at once. It may be a guardian, it may be a warning, it may be a force that requires respect, it may be a presence that explains why this stretch of water is not to be treated lightly. That is not a lesser kind of reality. In a practical sense, it may be a stronger one than many modern maps provide. There is something deeply sensible in that. Water is unlike land in the way it hides danger. A cliff announces itself eventually. A marsh can often be recognised before one walks too far into it. The sea and the river do not always grant such courtesy. A calm surface can conceal violent undertow. A narrow passage can carry a strong current. A dark inlet can appear inviting until one has the misfortune to learn more about it with one's entire body. Communities living with such places over generations develop ways of remembering them. Sometimes those ways are technical, sometimes they are ritual, often they are narrative, because stories keep hold of the mind long after lists of instructions have gone wandering. Seen in that light, the Taniwha becomes part of what might be called remembered water. Not water that literally stores human thought in some mystical filing cabinet, but water that carries accumulated human relationship. Certain places are remembered because ancestors travelled there, struggled there, were protected there, were lost there, or learned how not to be foolish there. The being associated with that place becomes a vessel for memory. It keeps the relationship alive. Even a modern person who does not share the full cosmological structure can still recognise the function. One does not have to reduce it to metaphor to understand that a named presence in dangerous water may preserve environmental knowledge, social memory, and moral expectation all at once. The examples recorded in Te Ara make this clearer. Tuhurangi is described as a guardian Taniwha, connected with Kupe and with Cook Strait, guiding and protecting canoes through treacherous waters. In another passage, Te Ara notes that tribes around Cook Strait spoke of Paniraira, a Taniwha resembling a whale, helping canoes across that difficult stretch. It also records that Maori identified the famous dolphin Pelorus jack with Tuhurangi, seeing in that animal not merely a curious marine escort, but a continuation or manifestation of an already meaningful guardian presence associated with hazardous passage. That last point is especially revealing. It shows how the boundary between animal and spiritual significance can remain permeable without becoming irrational. A dolphin repeatedly guiding ships through a dangerous passage is an observable event. interpreting that dolphin within an older framework of Taniwha is a cultural act, but not an arbitrary one. The water is dangerous. The guide is real. The relationship between place and guardian already exists in tradition. The modern animal is recognised through that older lens. There is no need here to force a choice between it was only a dolphin and it was literally a supernatural dragon. The tradition is doing something more subtle. It is identifying continuity in a place where guidance matters. This is where the phrase "waters that remember" begins to feel useful. The place remembers in the sense that stories, names, practices and beings remain attached to it. The crossing through Cook Strait does not become an anonymous physical event. It becomes part of an inherited map of significance. Dangerous waters often produce this effect because people do not meet them only once. They return to them. They depend on them. They survive them or fail to. Over time, the place thickens with meaning. The Taniwha is one way of acknowledging that thickness. It says in effect that the water is not empty and not neutral. It has character, force, claim, and history. There are also Taniwha traditions tied not only to sea passages, but to inland waters and landscape formation. Teara notes, for example, a Tuho tradition in which the female Taniwha Hamapuhia is said to have formed Lake Waikaremona while trying to break out to sea, and another in which Arietiuru guided the voyaging Waka Mamari from Polynesia to New Zealand, and is still regarded locally as a guardian associated with Hokianga Harbour. Again, these are not casual decorative stories pasted over geography after the fact. They are ways of understanding the relationship between people, water, movement, and place. A harbour, a lake, a channel, or a river bend can be rendered unforgettable when attached to a being whose story is retold through generations. One can read that as cosmology, as geography, as memory, or as all three. In fact, separating those two sharply may be a distinctly modern habit. Communities who live with a place do not always divide it into physical fact over here, symbolic value over there, and practical hazard somewhere else near the kitchen. The Taniwha can hold those dimensions together. That is one reason it would be a mistake to line up the Taniwha beside every other strange deep water report and say, here is another cryptid. The category is too small. A cryptid in the modern sense is usually imagined as a hidden biological organism awaiting documentation. The Taniwha can intersect with animals, certainly. Teara explicitly records that some Taniwha took forms such as sharks, whales, octopuses, or logs, and some change shape, but the tradition is not exhausted by the zoological question of whether a witness saw a misidentified shark. In many cases, the more useful question is what sort of relationship the being expresses between a people and a place. That said, it would be equally mistaken to conclude that no observational layer could ever be involved. Waters known for sharks may give rise to shark-shaped Taniwha, dangerous channels that repeatedly produce extraordinary encounters with dolphins, whales, currents, or floating logs can feed the imagery available to the tradition. The tradition does not have to be either pure symbol or misunderstood biology. Human cultures are rarely so wasteful with available experience. They absorb the world as it is encountered. A striking animal may become meaningful. A meaningful place may shape how an animal is remembered. The sea encourages exactly that kind of blending, because so much in it is partial, episodic, and charged with consequence. There is a practical wisdom in traditions of respect toward the sea as well. Teara's material on traditional seafood gathering notes that the sea was treated as a place to be respected, and that specific prohibitions governed behaviour, including how and when food was taken, and how people conducted themselves while gathering it. That does not mention Taniwha directly, but it belongs to the same broader moral landscape in which waters are not simply resources to be exploited at whim. They require conduct. They are entered under conditions, not entitlement. This makes the Taniwha especially interesting in a broader study of ocean mystery, because it shows that not every being of the deep is born from panic or error. Some are born from relationship. A modern deep-sea mystery often begins with the language of anomaly. Something odd was caught, filmed, reported or recovered, but older traditions are not always anomaly-based. They may begin instead from persistent presence. The being belongs there because the place itself belongs to a web of kinship, danger, memory, and guardianship. It is not simply an interruption in the known world. It is part of the known world, though known differently from a species list or sonar chart. That difference is easy to lose when retellings smooth everything into the same register of spooky entertainment. The result is usually less respectful and less interesting. It is less respectful because it strips the tradition from the people and places that give it meaning. It is less interesting because it flattens a multi-layered relationship into a single crude thrill. The Taniwha deserves better than to become only a creature for a thumbnail image and ominous music. It points toward a much older and more intelligent way of understanding certain waters as active participants in human life rather than passive scenery. And yet, even once all of that is said, one can still feel the eerie power of the image itself. A being in the water, a guardian in a cave by a dangerous pass, a presence at the edge of a lake, a form that may appear as shark, whale, reptile, log, or something changing between them. There is no need to apologise for finding that evocative. It is evocative. It is meant to be. Traditions survive because they carry force. They are memorable not merely because they are useful, but because they engage the senses and imagination strongly enough to endure. A warning wrapped in a being lasts longer than a warning written on a sign that weather will eventually peel clean off. There is also something quietly profound in the fact that Taniwha can be protective as well as dangerous. Modern monster culture often prefers a simple arrangement. The creature is hostile. The humans are victims, investigators, or eventually snack-sized. But many older traditions are less childish than that. Power in the natural world is rarely sorted into pure villain and pure ally. What matters is relationship, respect, conduct, and place. A guardian can still be terrible. A dangerous being can still be tied to protection under the right conditions. The water itself behaves similarly. It feeds, carries, and kills without needing to choose one personality forever. One might even say that the Taniwha expresses an ecological truth better than some modern categories do. Water is not a blank surface over hidden mechanics. It has agency in human life, if not agency in the simple personified sense, then certainly in the sense that it shapes movement, livelihood, risk, memory, and emotion. A named being attached to a body of water makes that agency explicit. It refuses the comforting fantasy that the place is inert until humans arrive to describe it. The place already matters, the Taniwha says so, from the perspective of this wider series of ocean entities that matters because it broadens what something lurking in the deep can mean. Sometimes it means an anomalous carcass, sometimes a larval form, sometimes a strange modern report, but sometimes it means a culturally rooted being that marks waters as alive with meaning and consequence. If all one seeks is a hidden flesh and blood animal, one may miss the more enduring pattern. Human beings repeatedly attach presence to waters that conceal danger and depth. The presence may later be rationalized, translated, sensationalized, or misunderstood, but it begins from a serious relationship with place. That seriousness helps explain why such traditions endure even in the modern age. Scientific mapping, dredging, photography, and shipping lanes do not erase older understandings overnight, especially when those understandings remain entangled with identity, ancestry, and local knowledge. A dangerous past remains dangerous even when charted. A harbour with centuries of stories attached to it does not become spiritually blank because someone has added GPS. If anything, the persistence of such traditions alongside modern navigation reminds us that not all forms of knowing are trying to do the same job. A chart tells you where the rocks are. A story tells you how to behave in a place where rocks, currents, ancestors, memory, and risk all matter at once. So when the Taniwha appears in the larger gallery of unexplained ocean entities, It should not be rushed past as merely a stop on the way to more modern oddities. It is one of the clearest examples of how deep or dangerous water becomes inhabited in human thought, not always because people are inventing things carelessly, but because certain places demand to be remembered with more force than plain description can manage. The being preserves caution, reverence, and relation. It makes water memorable. It gives shape to the fact that some crossings are never just crossings. And once that principle is recognised, it becomes easier to see why other traditions in other parts of the world produce their own edge-of-water presences as well. Different coastlines, different languages, different symbolic worlds, but the same recurring condition: uncertain water, difficult passage, partial encounters, and a story form robust enough to carry the warning forward. Sometimes the result is a guardian, sometimes a devourer, sometimes something glimpsed only in tail or surf or wake. The names change. The waters do not become any less willing to keep their own counsel. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs not to the deep sea itself, but to the human imagination when it stands at the water's edge with too little information and far too much symbolism. It is one thing to fear a large fish. It is another to fear a creature that seems to arrive already carrying meaning, already shaped by religion, omen, weather, and the uneasy conviction that the sea may be imitating us in ways it has no business attempting. This is where beings like the Isonade and the sea monk begin to matter. They are not simply odd creatures in old stories. They are examples of what happens when dangerous water and unsettled minds produce forms that seem half observed and half interpreted, with the interpretation arriving so quickly that it begins to harden into the body itself. Strictly speaking, they do not belong to exactly the same historical world. The sea monk appears in 16th century European natural history, while the Isonade is recorded in Japanese yokai tradition and early modern compilations such as Eihon Hyaku Monogatari. But they belong to the same larger human situation. In both cases, rough water, uncertain visibility, inherited fear, and the need to explain maritime danger combine into beings that are more than animals, and yet not entirely detached from them. They are shadows cast by the sea onto culture, and once those shadows take recognisable form, people begin to treat them with the seriousness reserved for things that might be both symbolically true and unpleasantly real. Medieval and early modern people were not filling the sea with monsters merely because they lacked modern science, and therefore had to keep themselves busy somehow. That flattering modern assumption tends to collapse on contact with actual sources. Bestiaries and illuminated manuscripts mixed real and imagined creatures quite freely, not because their makers were incapable of distinction, but because they were working within a worldview in which nature, morality, theology, and marvel were not cleanly separated. The British Library notes that medieval bestiaries included familiar animals, exotic ones known only through texts, and creatures rendered through a combination of inherited description and artistic imagination. In one manuscript, the Baie de Page shows a Sarah, a winged sea monster, and even a boat under attack from it. The same manuscript also includes sirens attacking a sleeping ship's crew. These are not field guides. They are visual records of a world in which the sea was already expected to harbour dangers that were physical, moral, and narrative all at once. That older visual habit matters when we come to the sea monk, because by the time it entered European circulation, the water was already crowded with meaningful forms. The sea monk was first described by Pierre Bellon in 1553, then by Guillaume Rondelet in 1554, and it was later included by Conrad Gessner in his widely read Historia Animalium in 1558. Reports placed its discovery sometime between about 1545 and 1550 in or near the Øresund, the strait between present-day Denmark and Sweden. The descriptions that circulated gave it a black head, fins placed around the middle of the body, a tail fin, and a ventral mouth, while the overall outline suggested to many observers a fish uncannily resembling a monk in habit. That combination of marine body and human religious outline was more than enough to guarantee the creature a long afterlife. It is hard to overstate how potent that image would have been in the 16th century. This was not simply a funny fish in a robe-shaped silhouette. This was the era of the Reformation, when theology and natural history were deeply entangled and irregular creatures could be read not just as curiosities, but as signs. A scholarly article on animals and religion in Reformation Europe notes that discussions of irregular or portentous animals exposed how people understood their relationships with nature, the divine, and the troubled present. Smithsonian's summary of modern scholarship on the sea monk makes the same point more directly. Theology was baked into natural history, and some contemporary readers may well have regarded such a creature as fearful, hybrid and significant rather than merely amusing. In other words, the sea monk was not eerie by accident. It surfaced into a culture already prepared to read marine irregularity as commentary. That helps explain one of the strangest details in the tradition, namely the claim that the King of Denmark ordered the creature buried so it would not become a source of offensive talk. Modern ears hear that and assume embarrassment of the usual sort, as if the problem was simply that someone had caught a grotesque fish in unfortunate condition. But in a period saturated with confessional conflict, symbolism clung to bodies very easily. A creature that looked monk-like could not help but brush against religious anxieties. Was it an omen? A joke from Providence? A satire written in flesh? An insult? A warning? A hybrid? Once the sea seemed to be producing religious forms, the boundary between zoology and polemic became alarmingly porous. And yet, for all the symbolic charge surrounding it, the sea monk may still have begun as a genuine animal badly filtered through description and expectation. Over the centuries, suggestions for its identity have included a giant squid, an anglerfish, a seal, a walrus, a fabricated Jenny Haniva, and most persuasively, an angel shark of the genus Squatina. Charles Paxton, whose work Smithsonian summarizes, regarded the angel shark as the likeliest explanation based on size, coloration, habitat, subtle scales and body structures that might have been read visually as a monk's habit. At the same time, he emphasized that certainty is impossible because the original animal was never preserved in a way that would let us settle the matter. That is such a perfect sea mystery outcome that one almost has to admire it. The body arrives, the shape spreads, the evidence decays, the argument survives. What makes the sea monk especially instructive is not simply that it might have been an angel shark, though that possibility is fascinating enough. It is that the identification, even if correct, does not erase the cultural phenomenon. An angel shark is already an animal with a strange and flattened body, broad fins, and an outline that can look uncanny when viewed from the wrong angle or described by someone determined to find familiar forms in it. Once that body enters a human environment charged with religious symbolism, it does not remain merely shark-shaped. It becomes interpretive clay. Its outline is kneaded by fear, language, and social tension until what emerges is not just an animal report but a moral image. The creature has not changed. The shadow around it has. That same process, though in a very different cultural setting, helps us understand the Isonade. The Isonade is a sea-dwelling yokai associated with the coasts of western Japan, especially around Hizen Matsura. It is described as shark-like, usually remaining hidden beneath the waves except for a huge tail fin covered in numerous barbs or hook-like projections. According to the Yokai Encyclopedia entry, it appears when strong north winds blow, gliding over the sea in such a way that sailors may notice only changes in the water and wind before the tail hooks them from their boats and drags them into the sea. The same source notes that the creature appears in Edo period curiosities such as Ehon Hyaku Monogatari and was tied in some regions to unexplained coastal deaths and to practical customs of seamanship aimed at avoiding disaster. There is something deeply elegant about that design. The body is mostly unseen. The attack comes through the tail. The warning signs are atmospheric rather than anatomical. The creature does not present itself like a fairy tale dragon rising obligingly into full view. It remains mostly in concealment, known through disturbance, weather, and sudden loss. That is an extraordinarily realistic way to imagine maritime danger. People at sea are often not granted the luxury of full perception. They get hints, a shift in wind, a change in colour, a movement at the edge of sight. Then the event is over, and someone is gone. The Aesinade gives this pattern a body without requiring that the body be fully visible. In that sense, it may be one of the most psychologically accurate sea beings ever devised. It also demonstrates again that such beings can encode practical knowledge without becoming any less fearsome. The Yokai Encyclopedia notes that traditions around the Aesinade were tied to maritime hazard awareness and caution, including avoiding noisy deck work, stowing equipment, and keeping clear of the rail in dangerous conditions. One does not have to believe in a literal barbed shark spirit to see the value in that. The sea remains dangerous whether the warning arrives as folklore or safety protocol. In fact, folklore often works better because it clings to memory more effectively. A written notice saying high winds and unstable footing increase the risk of being swept overboard is accurate. A being whose unseen tail drags sailors to their deaths is unforgettable. And here, very quietly, the Aesinade and the sea monk begin to resemble one another. Not in body, not in chronology, not in world view, but in function. Each emerges where water, danger, and human pattern making meet. Each is built partly from the limitations of perception. The sea monk takes a body and overlays it with familiar human shape. The Aesinade does almost the reverse, giving a dangerous event just enough body to explain its suddenness, while keeping most of that body hidden. One turns the sea into a parody of human religious form. The other turns the sea into an invisible predator known mainly by consequences. Both are maritime intelligence wearing story. There is another reason to place them together. Both belong to worlds in which people did not divide the strange into neat modern categories such as zoology over here, folklore over there, and atmospheric hazard in a separate bin with warning labels. A strange marine event could be all three. In Reformation Europe, irregular animals might carry theological weight. In Japanese yokai traditions, a sea being might express environmental risk, regional identity, inherited caution, and supernatural agency at once. Modern readers often become impatient with this layering because they want the answer to be singular. Was it real? Was it symbolic? Was it just a fish? Was it invented? Older traditions are generally less fussy. They are content to let one thing mean several things if the sea has earned the complexity. That layered quality is what gives these stories their shadowed feeling. A shadow is not pure darkness, it is shape with detail removed. The sea monk and the Aesinade both inhabit that kind of perceptual half-light. We know enough to describe them. We do not know enough to stabilize them fully. In one case, surviving illustrations and descriptions preserve a body that may have been filtered through art, rumour, and confessional unease. In the other, the lore preserves a predator mostly through tale, weather, and aftermath. Neither offers the clean satisfactions of a specimen on a tray. They are maritime shadows because they are made from partial evidence and complete emotion. Medieval manuscripts help explain why such shadows persisted so easily in Europe. The British Library's records show sea monsters and sirens directly attacking boats and sleeping crews in manuscript margins, while their overview of bestiaries emphasises that artists often worked from text and imagination, rather than first-hand observation when rendering exotic or fabulous beasts. That means the sea was already an illustrated theatre of peril, long before any fisherman hauled in a body that looked suspiciously monk-shaped. Once a culture has spent centuries painting marine danger as hybrid, moralised and semi-human, an odd catch is never merely an odd catch. It drops into an existing visual grammar. Everyone already knows how to look startled. Japan, of course, had its own grammar, and it was no less capable of making the sea feel populated by purposeful danger. The Aesinade's barbed tail, hidden body, and storm-linked arrival reflect a different symbolic system, but one equally rooted in the experience of maritime uncertainty. It is notable that old accounts connected it to signs in wind and sea colour before the strike itself. That is almost meteorological in structure. The creature becomes a narrative bridge between environmental cue and fatal event. You could call it a monster, but that would undersell how carefully it is fitted to the conditions of real seafaring anxiety. The most frightening thing about the Icenade is not its size, it is that one notices it too late. By comparison, the sea monk frightens in a more intellectual way. It looks wrong not because it is too hidden, but because it is too legible in the wrong register. A fish that resembles a monk is unnerving, because it seems to collapse categories that should stay separate. Nature should not mimic religious office. The sea should not hand back a body that looks as though it has been thinking about Europe's theological disputes. Hybrids are unsettling because they force ideas together that people prefer to keep apart. That is why so many old marine marvels look part human, part beast, part saint, part warning. The sea becomes terrifying when it appears to be speaking in our own symbolic language. And this, perhaps, is why old marine lore so often feels more disturbing than many modern monster stories. Modern monsters are usually built to entertain. They are designed with enough coherence to sell a poster, a documentary, or several very dramatic online comments. Older beings often feel less polished and more troublesome. They are not tidy villains. They are interruptions. They emerge from coastlines where people were trying to work, pray, travel, survive, or simply make sense of an event no one could fully explain. Their weirdness is not decorative. It is a residue of uncertainty. The sea monk is troubling because nobody quite knew what kind of thing it had been. The Icenade is troubling because no one could look long enough to know. Both forms of uncertainty stay with the mind. It is also worth noticing that these beings linger most stubbornly, where water is not just physically dangerous, but socially important. Narrow straits, fishing grounds, trade routes, and exposed coasts generate more stories than empty stretches no one needs to cross. The sea where something matters is the sea where memory takes root. The sea monk surfaced in a Europe deeply invested in natural history, royal correspondence, and religious dispute. The Icenade belongs to coastal traditions shaped by seamanship, weather, and local hazard. Stories from such places last because the water keeps demanding attention. A beast tied to an unimportant puddle has little career prospects. A beast tied to a feared coast can live forever. And because these waters matter, the beings attached to them become less like single sightings and more like reusable templates. The next unexplained death, the next violent weather shift, the next strange body, the next rumour of something shaped too much like a man or too little like a fish. Each can be gathered into the pattern already waiting. That does not make the pattern false, it makes it durable. Once a culture has learned to understand certain marine uncertainties through a shadowed being, later events will naturally return to that figure. The story remains useful because the sea keeps producing fresh ambiguities to feed it. This is the point at which the old shadows begin to stretch beyond Europe and Japan and toward a broader human habit, give people dangerous water, partial encounters, and a creature that can be both sign and animal, and similar structures begin appearing in very different places. Not the same creature, of course, not even the same emotional balance. Some become guardians, some become devourers, some become royal emblems, temple carvings, or cosmological hybrids rather than direct maritime threats. But the shared pattern remains. Water conceals, culture shapes. The result is a being that belongs half to the tide and half to thought. That larger pattern becomes even clearer when the creature is not just a shoreline terror or a disputed body in a naturalist's book, but a figure that moves confidently between religion, art, kingship, and the sea itself, becoming less a single monster than a whole category of meaningful aquatic form. Once that happens, we are no longer looking merely at something glimpsed in bad weather. We are looking at a being built at the seam where the ocean and symbol have learned to borrow each other's shapes. The Makara is one of the clearest examples of how a strange being can begin as a creature of the water and then become something larger than creaturehood without ever fully leaving the water behind. In Hindu tradition, the Makara is a mythic aquatic being, often described in composite terms, and Britannica summarises one common form as a water monster, with the body of a crocodile and the head of an elephant. Museum collections and art historical sources show that it was also linked with the water god Varuna, as is Vahana, or Mount, and it appears widely in South Asian religious and architectural art, rather than in one narrow story alone. That already tells us something important. The Makara is not a rumour from one frightened witness. It is a stable cultural form that kept being useful over a very long time because it sat exactly where water, power, protection, and imagination met. That durability matters because it changes the kind of mystery we're dealing with. The giant leptocephalus and the Zuyo Maru carcass show what happens when strange bodies force interpretation on us. The Makara shows what happens when a civilization takes the sea seriously enough to build a lasting visual language for it. It appears in Hindu contexts, Buddhist contexts, architectural contexts, decorative contexts, and even in quotidian objects. The Metropolitan Museum notes that the Makara appears not only on religious monuments such as the Barhut Great Stupa, including a gateway architrave and a railing pillar with a yaksha on Makara from around the 2nd century BCE, but also in the form of a toy from roughly the same period and region. The Met explicitly remarks that the presence of a mythical sea creature in a child's toy suggests that the water world is a sacred realm and abode of mythical creatures was widely known. That is a remarkable statement, because it means the Makara was not confined to temple doctrine or elite symbolism. It had entered ordinary cultural life. Children could pull one on wheels, and adults could carve one in stone over sacred thresholds. Once a being begins moving so easily between religion, architecture, ornament, and everyday objects, it stops being useful to ask whether it was just a monster. The more accurate question becomes what work it was doing. One obvious answer is that it carried water with it wherever it appeared. Lakima notes that architectural Makaras survive in India from at least as early as the 2nd century BCE, and that Makara forms were used in waterspouts, archways, and throne backs. Britannica likewise points to water issuing from Makara spouts in sculpture. This is not accidental decoration. A being associated with water, mounted by a water deity, and turned into a source from which water visibly pours is doing very concrete symbolic labour. It turns the built world into an extension of the aquatic world. It brings the force and ambiguity of the sea or river into stone in a controlled way. Put simply, the Makara is what happens when people want water to remain powerful, even after it has been disciplined into architecture, and the form itself helps explain why it works so well. The Makara is usually not a straightforward crocodile, fish, or elephant. It is a hybrid, and that hybridity is the whole point. Composite beings have a special advantage in myth and art because they can gather attributes instead of choosing only one. If a single animal seems too limited to express the force of water, then several can be joined. One part can suggest bite, another weight, another movement, another fertility, another grandeur. That is far more effective than insisting the sea must be represented by one obedient zoological specimen. Water is rarely obedient. It has mouths, currents, surges, hidden things, and changing surfaces. A beast born between animals is therefore a suitable ambassador for it. Even when sources differ on exact anatomy, they agree on the central idea that the Makara is chimeric and aquatic, which is enough to keep it hovering productively between recognition and invention. There is also a practical visual reason the Makara endured in temple and gateway art. Threshold creatures work best when they look as though they belong to a region slightly more dangerous than the place one is entering. The British Museum's collection shows carved Makara panels and architectural fragments from India, while the Met's early Buddhist material shows Makara appearing on gateways and pillars in the visual environment of the stupa. A creature placed at an entrance does not merely beautify it. It announces that passage matters. One is crossing into a zone where ordinary space has become charged space. A floral border can be lovely, but a Makara at the threshold tells you at once that this world is guarded by something that combines the aquatic, the liminal, and the not entirely classifiable. That is exactly the kind of creature one wants at a boundary, because boundaries are places where categories loosen and behaviour is expected to sharpen. This is where the Makara starts resembling the other beings in this larger ocean pattern, though in a more formal and less anecdotal way. The deep ocean often gives us creatures that seem assembled from conflicting instructions. A decomposed shark can resemble a reptile. A larval eel can seem like a transparent ribbon from some unreal branch of biology. The Makara does not wait for the sea to confuse us accidentally. It makes confusion deliberate. It presents a controlled hybrid, a beast that openly admits it was made from several kinds of force. In that sense, it may be one of the most honest water beings in the whole collection of ocean entities. It does not pretend to be taxonomically neat. It says at once that water exceeds clean categories, and that any creature fit to stand for water should exceed them too. The deep sea produces that lesson biologically. The Makara produces it symbolically. It is also important that the Makara moved across religious traditions rather than remaining locked in a single doctrinal corner. The Met's material on early South Asian art places Makara imagery in Buddhist monumental contexts from the late centuries BCE, while museum and reference sources tie it to Hindu iconography through Varuna and other water-linked divine associations. That kind of movement suggests the Makara was not marginal. It was part of a broader shared visual culture in which the water realm, fertility, power, sacred space, and protective imagery intersected. When a form survives across traditions and across centuries, it usually does so because it answers a recurring need. In this case, the need seems to have been for a being that could make visible the fact that water is generative, dangerous, prestigious, and not fully tame. The association with Varuna is especially telling. Lakma describes the Makara as the Mount of Varuna in Vedic sources, and both Lakma and the British Museum preserve later artworks showing Varuna riding a Makara. Varuna, as an important deity of waters, law, and cosmic order, is not a minor local figure borrowed briefly for decorative effect. If such a god rides a Makara, then the Makara is not merely an exotic fish with attractive teeth. It has been granted the role of bearer of sovereignty over the waters. It becomes part of divine transportation, yes, but also part of divine authority. The sea is not represented by something trivial. It is represented by something worthy of carrying a god. That tells us the beast occupies a space closer to emblem than anecdote. It is not a rumour washed ashore. It is an accepted image of what watery power looks like when given a body. This makes the Makara different from the sea monk and the Icenade, but only in degree, not in kind. The sea monk emerged from a suspicious body and a culture eager to read symbolic trouble into marine form. The Icenade emerges from danger at sea, and a tradition that gives that danger a hidden predator. The Makara comes from a world in which the water realm has already been granted full imaginative legitimacy, and therefore deserves a creature robust enough to stand for it in temples, ritual art, and public architecture. In all three cases, the sea does not stay mute. It becomes embodied. The difference is that the Makara is less tied to one event and more to an enduring grammar. It is what a civilization builds when it has stopped waiting for the next strange sighting, and instead decides to make permanent room for the beast in stone. There is another useful feature here. Because the Makara is not one fixed body, it absorbs local and temporal variation without losing identity. That gives it exceptional longevity. A modern cryptid often fails if too many details change. The audience wants consistency. Was it 12 feet long or 30? Did it have a mane, a hump, teeth, a horn? The Makara is built for variation. Its identity lies in combination rather than standardization. If one version leans crocodilian and another grows an elephantine snout or a fishtail, nothing essential has been lost. In fact, the flexibility is part of its success. Water itself is variable, and a water beast that cannot tolerate variation would be a poor representative. The Makara survives by being recognizable through role, placement and atmosphere as much as by anatomy. That is a very sophisticated strategy for a mythic creature, and one reason it travels so well through art. The toy noted by the Met may be the detail I like best, because it prevents the Makara from becoming too solemn. There is a tendency, when discussing mythic beasts in religious contexts, to freeze them into museum seriousness. Yet the toy says otherwise. Someone made a small-wheeled Makara, and someone else, likely a child, may have dragged it through dust centuries ago. The Met interprets that object as evidence that the idea of the water world as sacred and populated by mythical beings was widely known. I would add that it also shows how creatures born between myth and symbol become familiar without becoming ordinary. A child can play with a Makara and still grow up knowing it belongs to a realm of sacred power. That is a healthier relationship to mystery than we often manage today. We tend to split things too sharply into either entertainment or belief. Older cultures were often more comfortable letting a form be playful, dangerous, sacred, and decorative at the same time, and because the Makara could be all of those things at once, it became ideal for representing the edge where certainty ends. A threshold arch, a water spout, a divine mount, a stone panel, a toy, a protective emblem. None of these uses are random, they all sit near transition. Water itself is transitional. It joins and separates places. It gives life and removes footing. It marks crossings. It carries trade and death in the same medium. The Makara belongs wherever those facts need a body. That is why it looks less like one animal than like a verdict on the impossibility of reducing water to one animal. If one tried to carve the sea as a single ordinary beast, one would fail. The Makara solves that problem by refusing ordinariness from the start. This also helps explain why the Makara belongs in a series about unexplained ocean entities, even though it is not a disputed carcass or a cryptozoological report. The larger pattern here is not just that people think there are strange things in the deep, it is that whenever human beings confront waters too powerful, opaque, or consequential to be treated as mere scenery, they tend to generate beings that stand at the border between observation and meaning. The Taniwha marks remembered waters. The Isonade gives sudden maritime danger a tale and intention. The sea monk turns marine irregularity into a troubling symbolic body. The Makara takes the next step and becomes institutionalized ambiguity. It is the official beast of the place where water, holiness, danger, fertility, and passage all overlap. Once carved into architecture, the old uncertainty does not disappear, it is simply given a permanent address. Perhaps the most useful way to think about the Makara is this. It is not a failed attempt at natural history. It is a successful attempt at symbolic ecology. It does not ask to be pinned down as a hidden species. It asks to be recognized as the right kind of creature for a world in which the sea and rivers are powerful enough to deserve more than plain description. In that sense, it belongs very naturally beside all the other forms we have been considering. Some mysteries begin with bodies that look wrong. Others begin with places that need a guardian, a devourer, or a warning shape. The Makara shows what happens when a culture keeps that shape, refines it, teaches it, plays with it, and carves it into the places where people cross from the ordinary into the charged. It is a beast born not only between animals, but between myth and symbol, which may be why it lasted so long and travelled so far. And once one has accepted that some beings are not trying to be animals in the modern sense at all, it becomes easier to move toward traditions where the water creature is tied not to temples or carved gateways, but to harder climates, harsher coastlines, and stories told close to ice, where what moves beneath the surface is not always seen clearly enough to separate predator, omen, and inherited warning. After the carved confidence of the Makara, the north feels like a very different sort of water world. Here the sea does not arrive framed in temple stone or flowing neatly from a sculpted spout. It hardens, it creaks, it disappears under snow. It becomes a surface people must cross while knowing perfectly well that it is not empty beneath them. In Alaska's Arctic and subarctic waters, sea ice is not dead matter, but part of a larger living system that supports marine mammals, humans, and the work of travel and hunting. The National Park Service describes sea ice as a vibrant floating community, and notes plainly that hunting in these conditions has long been difficult and dangerous for indigenous Alaskans whose lives are closely tied to the ocean. That is the first thing worth remembering before the Tijuruk ever appears. The fear comes after the environment, not before it. The creature grows in a place where the surface can look still while life moves below it, and where a single mistake near the water's edge can be very final. The being most often called Tijuruk in modern retellings enters the record in a way that is already a little untidy, which is exactly as one might expect from a northern water monster. A recent Bowdoin College Arctic Museum exhibition on monsters in Inuit art identifies Palrayuk or Tijuruk as a lizard-like creature with many sharp teeth and multiple stomachs that lurks in shallow water, ready to devour people near the water's edge, posing a particular danger to kayakers. The same exhibit notes that in 1892, Inupiat artists at Siugak, or Cape Prince of Wales, drew monsters for an American missionary, which matters because it shows these beings were already established subjects in local visual culture rather than some late imported novelty. In other words, we are not dealing with a one-off campfire invention invented to pass a difficult evening. We're dealing with a figure serious enough to be drawn, remembered, and carried forward in art. A Smithsonian text built around Edward W. Nelson's Bering Sea collections makes the pattern even clearer. It describes the Palrayuk as a dangerous, alligator-like mythical beast that attacked hunters in their boats, and says images of it were painted on the sides of kayaks and umiaks, and used on hat ornaments and harpoons to ward off attack and help ensure a successful hunt. That is a remarkably practical arrangement. The creature is not only feared, it is managed. It is acknowledged in images placed directly on the vehicles and tools most exposed to maritime danger. This tells us something very important about the kind of being we are dealing with. The Tijuruk or Palrayuk is not simply an animal said to exist somewhere out beyond the horizon. It belongs close to human activity, close to boats, close to shore, close to the places where people launch, paddle, lean over, and get taken by the water when the water chooses badly. That closeness to the human edge is one reason the phrase beneath the ice feels so fitting, even when the old descriptions emphasize boats, kayaks, and shallow water rather than some grand trench in the open sea. In the Arctic, the boundary between surface and depth is especially deceptive. NOAA notes that ringed seals can live in heavily ice-covered areas and use their 4 flipper claws to maintain breathing holes through ice that may be 6 feet thick or more. CQ, which documents indigenous and scientific sea ice knowledge, explains just as plainly that seals must use such holes in winter to breathe, and that those holes become points exploited by predators and humans alike. An opening in the ice, then, is never just an opening. It is proof that something is moving below a surface you may be standing on. It is a little door in a place that otherwise looks closed. The Smithsonian material makes that world vivid in very concrete terms. It describes winter hunters crossing frozen seas, lakes and marshes, searching for life beneath the ice. Once a seal breathing hole was located, the hunter watched for signs from below, first hearing the bubbling of exhaled air, and then noticing movement in a straw marker as the seal rose into position. There is almost no better illustration of why northern waters produce beings like the Tijuruk. This is a world in which survival can depend on listening carefully to the sounds of an unseen animal coming upward through darkness and ice. The hunter above and the seal below are separated by only a little frozen surface, and yet each occupies a different world of visibility. If you live in such conditions, you do not need much encouragement to believe that other things might also move below you. Larger things, meaner things, things that do not come to a neat breathing hole and announce themselves politely. That, I suspect, is where the Tijuruk becomes more than a monster and more than a cautionary tale. It becomes a concentrated expression of an existing emotional truth. Arctic and subarctic waters already teach the body not to trust surfaces. Snow can hide openings, ice can hide water, water can hide animals. A person can stand in apparent stillness and yet be directly above movement, breath, teeth, or currents. The Tijuruk takes that general instability and gives it appetite. It says, in effect, that what is beneath may not merely exist, it may notice you. That is a very old and very useful escalation. A danger that merely exists is one thing. A danger that may watch for carelessness is far easier to remember. It is also notable that the old museum and Smithsonian descriptions do not present the creature in sleek, elegant, dragon-like terms. This is not a polished court monster. It is toothy, lizard-like, overbuilt, and somewhat rude in design. Baudouin's description gives it many sharp teeth and multiple stomachs. The Smithsonian text speaks of an alligator-like beast attacking hunters in their boats. There is a blunt practicality to that form. A creature with too many teeth and too much appetite is exactly what one would invent, or perhaps more fairly what one would remember, if the purpose were to give shape to waters where people vanish quickly and boats can be struck without warning. This is less the aristocratic serpent of embroidered legend, and more the local terror of the launch site, the thing that waits where human carelessness touches dangerous water. Because of that, I do not think the Tijuruk is best understood as a northern cousin of the classic open ocean sea serpent, even though modern retellings often flatten it into exactly that category. The older material we have at hand points somewhere more specific. Baudouin places the being in shallow water and says it threatens kayakers and people near the water's edge. The Smithsonian places its image on hunting boats and equipment as a form of protection against attack. Those details matter. They shift the creature from distant marvel to immediate hazard. This is not something glimpsed once in the far dark and then converted into a legend through embellishment. It is something narratively stationed near the practical edges of life, near launching places, crossings, and the zone where the hunter leaves land or ice and trusts himself to water. And once one sees that, the old protective images make perfect sense. A painted creature along the side of a kayak or umiak is not only decoration, it is recognition and negotiation. The Smithsonian text describes these images as charm figures meant to protect the boat's occupant from attack and to support the hunt. Baudouin says that in the 1800s, people painted Palrayak images on kayaks to ward off danger. That is wonderfully concrete. The monster is not locked in story alone. It rides with the hunter. It is put on the very skin of the boat. One can picture the logic easily enough. If the waters hold a being that attacks from below or from the margin, then one meets it first with acknowledgement. One does not go out into these waters pretending they are blank. One goes out marked, accompanied by the image of the thing that must be respected or held off. This is also where the Tijuruk starts to look less like a mistake about zoology, and more like an accurate account of a feeling. Not a feeling in the flimsy sense of something merely imagined, but a durable environmental emotion shaped by repeated experience. People who move between ice, shore, river mouth and sea know that danger often arrives from below, from hidden cracks, from a breath hole, from the sudden appearance of an animal, from the simple fact that the edge of water is a place where footing, buoyancy, and control all become conditional. The Tijuruk condenses that into one memorable aggressor. It lurks where kayaks tip, where people kneel, where they lean too close, where a child might play foolishly, where the surface seems calm and is not. That makes it less a random monster than a highly specialised one, tuned to the exact anxieties of its region. There is another detail that quietly strengthens this reading. Baudouin's exhibit frames many Inuit monster stories as cautionary tales about dangerous places and risky behaviours, while also noting that such stories describe fearsome creatures and how to avoid falling prey to them. That is a very balanced way of putting it. It does not reduce the beings to moral fables, and it does not insist on taking them as hidden species reports either. It recognises that the stories do practical work. They identify danger, they preserve memory, they teach habits. The Tijeruk belongs naturally in that company. A creature that waits in shallow water, threatens kayakers, and devours the unwary near the edge is doing exactly the kind of cultural work a harsh environment requires. It gives bad decisions a face. At the same time, it would be too simple to say that the Tijeruk is nothing but a warning label with teeth. Human communities rarely keep a story alive for generations unless it also grips the senses. One reason the Tijeruk endures is that it fits the visual and bodily experience of northern water so well. Ice already cracks without showing all of its structure. Animals already surface unexpectedly. Breathing holes already mark places where one knows something is below without seeing the whole body. Hunters already learn to read traces rather than full appearances. In such a world, a creature that is mostly known by lurking, sudden attack, and the uncertainty of what exactly is moving under the surface does not feel out of place. It feels proportionate. The environment has already done half the storytelling before anyone begins speaking. It is interesting too that the older materials tie the creature so strongly to boats and hunting life. Modern monster culture often wants the great reveal, the single photographic moment in which the beast is fully visible and obligingly centred in frame. The Tijeruk refuses that kind of courtesy. It belongs to the edge of vision and the edge of action. It is the thing below the kayak, beside the waterline, under the surface, near the place where a hunter is already occupied with something else. That makes it frightening in a more realistic way than many celebrated cryptids. Most actual danger is not cinematic. It is peripheral. It arrives while one is balancing, listening, harpooning, launching, or trying not to freeze. A monster shaped by that logic will be far harder to shake from the mind than one that rises majestically on schedule. The older hunting world recorded by the Smithsonian adds one more layer to this. The same material that describes protective images of the Palrayuk also describes a broader life in which spiritual respect, hunting success, beauty of tools, and the need not to offend powerful forces were intertwined. That context matters because it keeps us from reading the Tijeruk as a lonely beast floating free of everything else. It belongs to a system in which animals, spirits, tools, and human behaviour are all entangled. The hunter does not merely carry equipment, he carries relationships, obligations, and protections. The monster therefore belongs not only to fear, but to etiquette. One must hunt properly, travel properly, and respect the powers of the place one enters. The water is dangerous, yes, but it is also morally crowded. That moral crowding is one reason I think the Tijeruk remains so useful in a long chain of unexplained ocean entities. It shows that a deep water or cold water being does not have to begin as a specimen gone wrong, or a newspaper report gone wild. It can begin as a structured answer to a recurring human condition. The condition here is simple enough. The world under ice is alive, mostly unseen, and often fatal to the careless. Seals maintain breathing holes, hunters read them. Marine mammals rest, travel, and feed around shifting ice. The ice itself changes, cracks, and carries risk. The National Park Service notes that sea ice loss now makes hunting even more difficult and dangerous, which is a modern reminder that the old relationship between ice and peril was never theoretical in the first place. The Tijeruk gives that entire condition a face with teeth and appetite. And perhaps that is why the creature feels so persistent even now. Not because one expects to find a perfect zoological Tijeruk gliding up obligingly under modern survey equipment, though people will always hope for something of the kind, but because the fear it expresses has not gone anywhere. Stand on Arctic ice, lean over a black lead in the floes, watch a breathing hole remain still for a long time, then remember that movement can be occurring underneath without any visible sign at all. The old story does not feel childish in that setting. It feels like a hard local truth given memorable anatomy. Something may move below you. Something may come up where the surface seems secure. Something may take the unwary first. Once a culture has lived with those facts long enough, it is only a matter of time before the unseen thing acquires a name and begins riding on the sides of boats. And from there, the path into more modern accounts becomes almost inevitable. Because once the old northern water has already taught people to expect hidden movement under hostile conditions, the step from traditional water beings to 20th century reports of strange underwater humanoids, military secrecy, and divers meeting things they cannot classify is not as large as it first appears. The temperature changes, the equipment improves, the rumour gets a modern haircut, but the basic setting remains much the same. Cold water, bad visibility, human beings operating at the limit of control, and the stubborn feeling that the sea is still holding back forms we have not learned how to place. There is something almost comforting about an old sea monster, a serpent in rough water, a guardian in a dangerous strait, a beast attached to a cave, a reef, a pass or a current. Such creatures belong to a world in which mystery speaks in the language of myth, and myth at least has the courtesy to admit what it is doing. The modern version is more complicated. The modern abyss does not always send up dragons. Sometimes it sends a rumour in military phrasing, a classified report, a declassified file no one quite seems to have in hand, a tale told not by monks or fishers, but by divers, officers, and unnamed survivors said to have seen something impossible at depth. That is where the so-called Russian aquinoids belong, not only in water but in the modern habit of attaching the unknown to secrecy, bureaucracy, and the promise that somewhere there must be documents. The setting matters enormously. Lake Baikal is not just any body of water chosen at random by a storyteller with a taste for the dramatic. UNESCO describes it as the world's oldest and deepest lake, about 25 million years old and roughly 1,700 metres deep, holding around 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. Its age and isolation have also produced one of the richest and most unusual freshwater faunas on Earth. Even before a single rumour enters the picture, it is already the kind of place that feels as though it ought to contain secrets, partly because it really does contain extraordinary biology, and partly because vast depth in a remote, cold environment always encourages the impression that much could remain unseen. Modern science has not exactly made the lake feel less uncanny. Researchers have used Lake Baikal for serious deep-water work, including the Baikal GVD neutrino telescope, which an Arxiv paper by the collaboration described as operating in the largest and deepest freshwater lake in the world, and, at the time of that report, as the largest operating neutrino telescope in the Northern Hemisphere. There is something almost too perfect about that. In older centuries, dangerous water gathered spirits and guardian beasts. In the modern age, it gathers strings of light sensors hanging in the dark to catch signals from astrophysical neutrinos, and the place still somehow feels no less suited to rumour than it did before. The technology changes. The human response remains suspiciously familiar. Even the lake's ordinary natural facts have a tendency to sound slightly theatrical when stated plainly. It is home to the Baikal seal, or Nerpa, which the Leibniz Institute of Freshwater Ecology and Inland Fisheries notes is the only seal species with all its populations living in freshwater. The same source says it is endemic to Lake Baikal and can dive to over 300 metres. A freshwater lake with endemic seals is already the sort of biological sentence that sounds as though it was drafted by someone trying to make a mystery seem credible. One does not need aliens to make Baikal feel unusual. The lake has been handling that task quite capably on its own. And then there are the lake's physical oddities. NASA's Earth Observatory documented strange circular areas of thinned ice visible from space in 2009 and noted that similar patterns had been observed there before, with the precise origin still uncertain though suggestive of convection or upwelling in the water column. That kind of phenomenon is not evidence for humanoids in silver suits, of course. It is something subtler and perhaps more important. It shows how a place can accumulate an atmosphere of anomaly without needing anything supernatural at all. When a lake is old, deep, remote, full of endemic life, capable of strange behaviour in ice and water, and associated with heavy military or scientific infrastructure, rumour does not have to force itself into the scene. The scene is already waiting for it. The story usually told about the Russian aquanoids or the Lake Baikal swimmers arrives in a very specific form. In later retellings, usually set in 1982 during a Soviet military dive or training exercise, a group of divers at around 50 metres supposedly encountered unusually tall humanoid figures in tight silvery suits, sometimes with spherical or dome-like head coverings and no visible breathing apparatus. In the more dramatic versions, the divers were ordered to capture one of the beings, tried to do so, and were then blasted or thrust upwards so violently that several died from decompression-related injuries while others were badly hurt. That is the now familiar shape of the tail, and it has become so standardised that it behaves less like testimony and more like folklore with military trim. What is especially interesting is how modern the beings are. They are not scaled serpents or giant fish or spirits attached to a crossing. They are humanoids. They wear something like suits. They move like divers but are said not to use ordinary gear. This is a 20th century deep water being, born in an era saturated with submarines, classified programs, Cold War secrecy, and extraterrestrial speculation. If medieval Europe produced the sea monk and older traditions produced guardians, punishers and hidden devourers, late Soviet rumour produced underwater anthropoids in metallic clothing. The abyss, it seems, updates its wardrobe to match the age that fears it. The timing of the legend's rise into wider international circulation is one of the most revealing parts. In 2009, outlets such as Wired and Gizmodo reported on claims that the Russian Navy had declassified Cold War UFO records, with both pieces repeating the line that a large share of such encounters were associated with oceans and lakes, and mentioning an alleged 1982 Lake Baikal case in which 3 diver trainees died while pursuing humanoid creatures dressed in silvery suits. That reporting did not independently authenticate the incident. What it did do was give the story a modern delivery system. Once the words declassified, Navy, Cold War and Lake Baikal were arranged in the right order. The rumour no longer needed to prove much. It only needed to sound like something hidden. This is the key difference between older marine legends and modern abyssal rumour. Older legends often begin with place and experience, then grow through retelling. Modern legends often begin with the suggestion of paperwork. A file exists, a report exists, a witness exists but is unnamed. The document was declassified, leaked, summarised or quoted in translation, though the reader is rarely invited to inspect the archive directly. The authority no longer comes from the village elder or the repeated caution of a coastline. It comes from the performance of official secrecy. The story feels real because it appears to have been bureaucratically buried, which in the modern imagination is almost as good as evidence and sometimes unfortunately better. That does not mean nothing happened in Lake Baikal in 1982. It means that what can be verified publicly is much thinner than the viral version suggests. Skeptoid's summary of the case is blunt. The story of the alien divers in Lake Baikal has no reliable provenance, no original source, and no corroboration, and it is often reported as though it came from a 2009 release of declassified Soviet documents. That distinction matters. Reported as though is not the same as demonstrated by. The difference between those two phrases is exactly the space in which modern legends breathe. Later skeptical retellings push the point further. One such summary says the modern legend first appeared in a book by the Soviet/Russian ufologist Vladimir Azhaja. and adds that managers at the relevant diving base dismissed the story as nonsense, saying there had been no diver deaths there matching the claim. I would treat that specific reconstruction cautiously, because it is itself a later summary and not the missing original archive. But it does point to the larger problem. The story's source chain is messy, and the more confidently the incident is repeated online, the less often one is shown a verifiable Soviet document containing the exact details now treated as canonical. That is a classic sign not of an airtight cover-up, but of a rumour that has been polished by repetition. And yet the story persists, because it is very well built. It has the right ingredients. The witnesses are not tourists, but trained military divers. The setting is not a random pond, but the deepest lake on Earth. The entities are not blurry blobs, but humanoids, which always draws more attention because humans are professionally unable to ignore anything shaped even vaguely like themselves. The consequences are severe. 3 dead, several injured. The implication is not merely that something unknown was seen, but that contact with it was physically costly. The rumour therefore offers not just mystery but stakes. That makes it far harder to forget than a simple report of an odd shape below the ice. There is also the lure of inversion. We are used to imagining divers as the ones who descend into another world equipped, prepared, and technologically superior to what they will meet there. In this story, that hierarchy collapses. The alleged beings are underwater without visible tanks. They are at ease in depth, where the humans are only temporary visitors. The armed and trained side becomes the vulnerable side. This is an old pattern in water lore, but translated into modern terms. The old sea says, again, you're not the natural authority here. Only now it says so to Soviet divers in gear rather than to sailors in oars and wool. The rumour also benefits from how difficult underwater perception already is. Divers deal with cold, pressure, altered colour, limited visibility, equipment noise, and the psychological strain of depth. Fast misjudgments can happen. Panic can happen. Rapid ascent can injure or kill. None of that proves the Baikal swimmer's story false, but it does mean that one does not need a full squad of underwater humanoids to create tragedy around a dive. A stressful, badly managed or misinterpreted underwater event can become fatal, and then, if surrounded by secrecy or rumour, become narratively fertile in ways that simple terrestrial incidents often do not. The sea has always been good at turning accident into legend when the witnesses come back shaken and the evidence does not rise with them. There is another quieter reason the aquanoid story travels so well. Lake Baikal already sits at the meeting point of science, military presence, ecology, local sacred geography, and visual strangeness. It has unique animals, extraordinary depth, enduring cultural significance, under-ice worlds, remote shorelines, and enough atmospheric severity to make almost any tale set there sound more plausible than it would elsewhere. In a sense, the rumour drafts behind the lake's real magnificence. The place does some of the storytelling by itself. A shallow, muddy, unremarkable reservoir would not sustain the same narrative. Baikal can, because Baikal feels larger than ordinary explanation even when the explanation is right there. And this, perhaps, is where the modern abyss of rumour truly begins. Once a setting has enough genuine strangeness, the rumour no longer has to be perfectly sourced. It only has to be narratively compatible with the place. The internet then does the rest. Details standardise, heights are fixed, depths are repeated, helmets become clearer in each retelling. The beings become more humanoid, more silver, more deliberate. By the time the story reaches video essays, forums, and recycled declassified posts, it has become smoother than almost any real military incident ever is. Reality is ragged. Rumour is an excellent editor. I think that is why the aquanoids belong in this larger sequence of ocean entities, even if the case itself remains poorly evidenced. They show that the old machinery has not stopped working. People still attach hidden life to dark water. They still imagine intelligent or semi-intelligent presences beneath the surface. They still interpret dangerous environments through beings that match the anxieties of the time. The only real change is costume. The medieval shadow becomes the Cold War humanoid. The sacred guardian becomes the declassified file. The devouring thing below becomes a report no one can quite source but everyone remembers. There is even something oddly fitting in the way the story resists final settlement. If hard proof emerged tomorrow, the tale would change categories and become either an extraordinary historical event or a solved misinformation case. As it stands, it remains suspended, which is exactly where these things tend to live best. Too vivid to vanish, too poorly founded to satisfy, too well matched to its setting to sound entirely ridiculous, too dependent on second-hand authority to become secure. It is the rumour equivalent of deep water itself. One can lower instruments into it, but clarity is always just a little less than one hoped. And if one asks what the most likely explanation is, the honest answer is not glamorous. The strongest conclusion is simply that the public story, in the form now repeated, is not supported by a verifiable chain of primary evidence. Beyond that, possibilities branch out untidily. Perhaps it was based on a real diving accident later overgrown with ufological detail. Perhaps it was an outright fabrication attached to a plausible setting. Perhaps it was stitched together from several different rumours, plus the irresistible magnetism of Lake Baikal itself. That kind of uncertainty is frustrating if one wants a verdict, but it is also instructive. It shows how modern legends are built not from nothing, but from secrecy, environment, technological awe, and just enough plausibility to make skepticism feel slightly less satisfying than it ought to. What makes the Aquanoid story especially useful, then, is not that it proves there are underwater humanoids in Siberia. It is that it reveals how modern people continue to populate the deep with beings that reflect their own era's fears. Earlier cultures gave the water gods, guardians, tails, hooks, jaws, or temple forms. The 20th century, shaped by submarines, spaceflight, and military secrecy, gave the water silver suits and unexplained tactical encounters. The rumour is modern in every respect except one. Its emotional core is ancient. Something moved where humans were not meant to stay long. Something in deep water seemed more at home than the people who entered it. That is a very old sentence wearing a Soviet coat. So when people speak of Russian aquanoids, what they are really invoking is not just a dubious Cold War incident, but a whole modern style of abyssal thinking. A remote body of water, partial access, official language, missing files, trained witnesses, deaths, anomalous beings shaped like us, but not dependent on our gear. It is the perfect rumour for an age that trusts documents more than myths, yet still longs for the same old thrill of hidden intelligence below the surface. And once that style of story takes hold, the next strange entity does not need a monastery, a folk song, or even a fishing net. It can arrive through a nickname, a disputed image, an obscure report, or a creature given a title dramatic enough to sound half zoological and half invented, which is often exactly how the newest things from dark water first announce themselves. By the time we reach the present, the sea has not stopped producing strange entities. It has simply changed the way they arrive. In older centuries, an unexplained being might emerge from a carved gateway, a fisherman's warning, a monastery chronicle, or a body rotting in a net. Now it may arrive through remotely operated vehicle footage, a cropped image on a phone screen, a headline that outruns its own evidence, or a nickname sticky enough to travel farther than the original sighting ever did. The age of strange sightings is not an age in which the ocean suddenly became more mysterious. It is an age in which mystery learned how to circulate faster. That matters because modern deep-sea weirdness comes in at least two very different forms. One form is entirely real and documented, yet looks so improbable that it still feels as though it belongs on the older side of myth. The other form is looser, more slippery, and often attached to coasts, rumours, and recycled stories whose names drift a little each time they're told. Put those two forms together and you get a particularly modern kind of marine uncertainty. Not the clean folklore of a guardian tied to one place. Not the clean science of a species described once and settled forever. Something in between. A real animal that looks invented. A local legend that acquires new spellings, new thumbnails, and new confidence online. That is why the phrase abyssal chimera feels so fitting, even if it is not a formal zoological title. Chimeras are real deep-sea fishes, closely related to sharks and rays, but distinct from them. Smithsonian Ocean notes that ghost sharks, which are chimeras, live in deep water, can exceed 6 feet depending on species, and have reflective tissue behind the eyes that contributes to their eerie, ghost-like appearance. Another Smithsonian Ocean page points out that deep-sea chimeras are rarely seen, and that their lineage separated from sharks roughly 400 million years ago. In other words, before one says a single dramatic thing about them, the facts have already done most of the atmospheric work. They are ancient, deep-living, cartilaginous, and visually unsettling in exactly the way humans never quite stop noticing. NOAA's material on chimeras only reinforces the point. Its Creatures of the Deep feature describes the animal as found around 4,200 feet down, with sensory organs on the face that detect electrical fields in the water, while NOAA Ocean Exploration highlights rhinochimeras, whose long noses make them look as though someone tried to design a fish while thinking too hard about a sword, a rabbit, and a forgotten machine part all at once. These are not monsters invented to explain the deep. They are residents of the deep whose appearance happens to overlap uncannily with the kinds of things older people would have been accused of inventing, and modern science is still meeting them in fragments. In September 2024, Smithsonian Magazine reported the description of a new species, the Australasian narrow-nosed spookfish, Hariota avia, from deep waters off New Zealand and Australia. The report notes that the fish lives at depths greater than 1.5 miles, that scientists still know very little about chimeras, and that more than 50 known species have been identified, most within the last 2 decades. That last detail is especially important. It means that even now, with research vessels, genetic analysis, and high-definition imaging, the deep sea continues to yield members of a group so strange that their very ordinary scientific names sound as though they should be accompanied by organ music and poor life choices. There is something very revealing in that. The old sea monster tradition taught people to expect that the deep might contain things too odd for quick explanation. Modern research has not erased that expectation. It has partly confirmed it, though usually in a more disciplined tone. The confirmed creature is not a dragon or a submerged civilization. It is a ghost shark with a whip-like tail and a sensory face, living in darkness at impossible depth, belonging to a lineage older than most mountain ranges we casually trust. That is not less strange than folklore. It is simply a strangeness with institutional logos attached. This changes the emotional balance of modern sightings. When an older sailor claimed to have seen something bizarre, listeners could suspect embellishment. When a modern research team releases footage of a chimera hovering in black water, the bizarre thing is no longer hypothetical. It is present, documented, and still somehow unsatisfying to the part of the mind that wants categories to stay polite. We tell ourselves that a scientific explanation should make the creature feel ordinary. Often, it does the opposite. Once one learns that the animal is real, ancient, poorly understood, and adapted to a region humans barely visit, the imagination is not calmed so much as given official permission to continue. That is one half of the modern age of strange sightings. The real animal looks like a rumour and survives being real. The other half is murkier. It involves places where the water is dramatic enough, or storied enough, that the sighting begins spreading before the label is fully settled. This is where the looser part of the chapter belongs, the part gathered in your topic under the name Auli'ipea. Publicly accessible, higher quality documentation for that exact label is thin, but the better attested folklore around it points toward the coastal legend of the Ayia Napa, or Cape Greco sea monster in Cyprus, a being said in local legend to inhabit the waters around the Cape. One travel reference on Cape Greco describes local folklore about the legendary Ayia Napa sea monster in the waters off the headland. and another Cyprus-focused source notes the same legend, describing the creature as a sea monster associated with Cape Greco and linking it in local interpretation to older Greek seafaring myth, particularly Scylla. Now, I would tread carefully here, because this is exactly the sort of case in which the modern internet improves nothing except the speed of confusion. The coast itself is real. Cape Greco is a striking headland in southeastern Cyprus, known for sea caves, cliffs, clear water, and long maritime visibility. That alone is enough to encourage stories, add a local monster legend, a tourist economy that does not mind a little mystique, and an online culture eager to convert every regional tale into a portable cryptid, and you get a modern sighting environment in which names multiply faster than evidence. The being becomes less important than the circulation. The coast does not have to produce a body, it only has to produce an atmosphere. An atmosphere, to be fair, is one of the sea's most durable products. Cape Greco is exactly the sort of place where one can imagine a strange form moving just beyond confidence. Rugged cliffs, caves cut by waves, water that looks clear until it suddenly does not, a headland already associated with old tales, a modern visitor with a camera and no obligation to be precise. It is not difficult to see how a local sea monster tradition could survive there quite comfortably, even if the strongest proof available remains mostly the endurance of the story itself. In such cases, the legend persists not because everyone is convinced, but because nobody is especially motivated to empty the place of its possibilities. This is where the modern age differs sharply from the older one. In earlier traditions, a being attached to a coast or channel often remained relatively local, shaped by the people who knew that place best. In the internet age, however, a local sea creature can be detached from its geography, renamed, aestheticized, and fed into a wider machine of speculation. One retelling emphasizes a serpent, another emphasizes friendliness, another tries to trace it back to antiquity, another makes it sound as though a full biological mystery is only one expedition away from resolution. The creature becomes a collage. The internet, one might say, performs on legends what the sea performs on carcasses. It strips, stretches, and rearranges until the outline is memorable, and the original context has become inconveniently difficult to recover. That does not make the resulting story worthless. It simply changes what the story is. The modern cryptid attached to a scenic coast is often less a direct witness tradition than a layered object made of folklore, tourism, reposting, and the visual habits of online culture. A real cave becomes a monster cave, a local nickname becomes a global creature file, an uncertain shape in water becomes a thumbnail, someone adds dramatic music, and by the following week the being is no longer a regional curiosity, but a candidate for the long-running human claim that the sea is still hiding one large answer from us all. This is why I think it is useful to hold the abyssal chimera and the Cape Greco-style monster legend side by side. They reveal two opposite ways in which the modern ocean remains strange. In one case, the documented creature is genuinely bizarre enough to look folkloric. In the other, the folkloric creature survives because the setting remains visually and emotionally hospitable to weirdness. One comes upward through research and still looks impossible. The other comes sideways through story and still feels plausible enough to keep. Both tell us something about the current era. We are not living in a time when marine mystery has vanished. We are living in a time when mystery is split between official encounter and unofficial circulation. The official encounter has its own peculiar theatricality now. A chimera appears on a remotely operated vehicle feed, and thousands of people see it at once. They do not have to imagine the face. The face is there. The long tail is there. The gliding, almost unhurried movement is there. The comments fill with language that sounds suspiciously medieval despite the platform being made of code and electricity. Ghost, alien, ancient, demon, fairy, fake. We may be watching a scientifically documented fish, but we still respond like people at the edge of an older world because the body in front of us has not agreed to look proportionate to our expectations. That is an important point. Technology does not cancel the emotional life of the witness. It only changes the witness from one person on a deck to many people looking at a clip. A research camera does not remove the old human reflex to overread a shape. It simply distributes that reflex more efficiently. A video of a real deep-sea chimera can therefore produce reactions very similar to those once produced by a sea serpent report. The difference is that the modern witness has evidence and still feels uneasy. In some ways, that is a more sophisticated anxiety. It is one thing to fear what might be there. It is another to know that something demonstrably there already looks like an error in reality. On the other side, the unofficial circulation of modern legends has grown more nimble than the local traditions from which it often feeds. The Ayia Napa or Cape Greco sea monster can be lifted from one coastline and discussed as if it belonged to the same category as a blurry lake monster, an alleged prehistoric survivor, or a submarine anomaly. Once that happens, it loses some of its local texture and gains portable weirdness. That portability is one of the signatures of the age. A creature no longer needs to remain where it was born. It can be exported instantly, stripped of the quieter details that originally kept it tied to one coast, one community, one set of caves, one body of water. And yet, for all that distortion, the core pattern remains recognizable. A dramatic coast accumulates stories. A difficult or beautiful marine setting encourages the feeling that something more than scenery lives there. Real deep-sea animals continue to look like unfinished drafts from a more extravagant planet. New species are still being described. The public remains only partly able to distinguish between a rare fish, a local legend, a viral fabrication, and a genuinely unresolved report. That is the modern oceanal landscape, and it is not especially tidy. It may even be less tidy than the older one, because the old village or harbour usually knew roughly what sort of being belonged to its waters. The modern internet knows everything badly and simultaneously. It can place a newly described spookfish beside an unverified sea monster clip and a retold local legend, then invite everyone to decide which is the most unbelievable. The answer, of course, is often the real fish. The deep sea has that advantage. It does not need embellishment. It merely needs exposure. What I find most revealing is that both types of modern strangeness still orbit the same old emotional centre. The old question was never simply, is there a monster in the water? The deeper question was always, how much of this environment remains outside the reach of ordinary certainty? Deep-sea chimeras answer that question one way. They say, more than you think because creatures can be real, ancient, and still only partly known. The loose coastal legends answer it another way. They say, more than you think because a place can keep producing the feeling of hidden life, even when no decisive proof arrives. One gives us confirmed weirdness. The other gives us persistent possibility. And possibility is not a small thing. A world entirely without possibility would be one in which every coastline had been psychologically flattened, every cave reduced to geology alone, every deep water fish turned into a familiarity so complete that nobody paused at its silhouette anymore. We are not living in that world. We are living in one where the ocean still produces footage that feels fictional and legends that refuse to become fully obsolete. The age of strange sightings is therefore not simply an age of error. It is an age of overlap, where science, folklore, tourism, visual media, and lingering uncertainty all keep brushing against one another like shapes under black water. So when we place the abyssal chimera beside the more slippery figure gathered under names like allure, we are really looking at two different futures of the same old marine instinct. One future is empirical but no less eerie. The other is culturally diffuse but no less persistent. Between them stands the sea, still large enough to support both discovery and rumour at once, still willing to let a real animal look like a fable, and a fable cling to a real coast long after the supposed evidence has gone wandering. And once all these fragments are laid next to one another, the larval oddities, the carcasses, the guardians, the hidden tails, the temple beasts, the under-ice devourers, the classified swimmers, the ghostly real fish, and the coastlines that keep inviting one more sighting, a larger pattern begins to take shape, one that matters more than any single creature ever could. What if the mistake has been there from the beginning? Not in the sightings themselves, not in the stories, not even in the people who told them, but in the question we keep asking. Because again and again, when strange beings are said to dwell in deep water, we ask, what was the creature? We ask whether it was a shark, a ghost, a reptile, a hidden species, a hoax, a god, a misunderstood carcass, or a frightened invention. Those are fair questions, and sometimes they even help. But they may not be the deepest ones. A deeper question might be this: why do the same conditions keep producing the same kind of report? Why do dark, dangerous, badly observed waters generate creatures that are half evidence and half interpretation, no matter which century, coastline or culture we look at? Once you begin looking at the cases that way, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The Taniwha traditions of Aotearoa are tied to waters that are dangerous, remembered and morally charged, not merely to one zoological puzzle. Teara describes Taniwha as beings associated with lakes, rivers, seas, deep pools, caves, and dangerous waterways, while its account of Kaitiakitanga makes clear that Maori environmental thought is built on guardianship, protection, and a view of people as part of the natural world rather than separate from it. In that frame, a being in the water is not just a monster candidate. It is a way of marking a relationship between human conduct and a place that demands respect. Now place that beside the Isonade. Yokai.jp describes it as a shark-like sea yokai from western Japan, whose barbed tail hooks sailors from boats, especially when strong north winds blow, and whose body is often sensed through shifts in sea colour and wind before it is seen. That is not a random design. It is a creature built from maritime conditions in which weather, poor visibility and sudden loss matter more than a full clear sighting. The sea monk works differently, but the mechanism is related. The 16th century European report circulated through Bellon, Rondelet and Gessner, and the best modern interpretation summarised by Smithsonian points toward an angel shark, seen through a culture in which theology and natural history overlapped, making resemblance itself powerful enough to turn a marine body into a moral and symbolic event. Then move farther north. The Bodouin Arctic Museum describes Palrayuk or Tijaruk as a lizard-like creature with many sharp teeth and multiple stomachs, lurking in shallow water and threatening people near the water's edge, especially kayakers. The same exhibit notes that such images were painted on kayaks in the 1800s to ward off danger. That fits almost too neatly with the actual conditions of Arctic marine life. NOAA notes that ringed seals maintain breathing holes through thick ice, and the National Park Service points out that sea ice environments are dangerous for both marine mammals and the indigenous Alaskans whose lives have long depended on them. In a world where the surface can look solid, while unseen life moves below it, a being that waits beneath the edge is not simply an ornament of fear. It is a practical way of remembering how easy it is to be taken by water that looks quiet. The Makara makes the same point from another angle. Britannica calls it a Hindu water monster, and art historical collections show it as a composite aquatic being associated with Varuna, architecture, waterspouts, gateways, ritual objects, and protective forms. The Met's early example of a wheeled toy Makara, and Lachma's description of Makara as a composite aquatic creature used in waterspouts, archways, and as Varuna's Vahana show that it was never confined to one story or one panic. It became a stable image because water required a body large enough, mixed enough, and powerful enough to stand for danger, fertility, passage, and sacred force at the same time. In other words, when a culture lives long enough with powerful water, it often stops waiting for the next odd sighting, and simply installs the beast permanently at the threshold. Now set those traditions beside the biological puzzles. The giant leptocephalus matters because it shows that some marine mysteries do not begin with fantasy at all. They begin with life stages that look nothing like their adult forms. A transparent, ribbon-like larva implies a future body the observer cannot see. and in doing so it tempts the mind toward hidden giants and unknown adults. The same goes for carcass cases. The Zuyo Maru remains became famous because their outline looked prehistoric, but the leading skeptical explanation has long been that a decomposing basking shark can lose exactly the parts that make it obviously shark-like and keep just enough structure to resemble something much older. That is not a boring solution. It is a lesson in how the sea can produce convincing false silhouettes without lying at all. This, I think, is the first big piece of the pattern. The sea is an environment that routinely gives us incomplete bodies, larvae, damaged carcasses, glimpses, fins without torsos, tails without heads, distorted proportions, animals seen at the wrong angle, in the wrong weather, or at the wrong stage of life. On land, many animals are kind enough to identify themselves promptly. In the water, especially deep or rough water, identity often arrives late, if it arrives at all. That alone would be enough to generate centuries of misidentification. But the pattern runs deeper than simple error, because people do not just misidentify what they see, they interpret it according to what the place already means. That is the second piece. Dangerous waters are rarely left culturally blank. They become remembered waters. Some are attached to guardians, some to devourers, some to omens, some to formal symbols in art, some to cautionary stories for children and hunters, some to stories told quietly before launching a boat. This is not evidence that the creature itself must be physically present in every tale. It is evidence that human communities keep encountering the same environmental conditions and solving the memory problem the same way. They put a being there. They do this because a being is easier to remember than a paragraph, and because a dangerous current with a name and appetite tends to inspire better behaviour than a dangerous current described as a fluid dynamics issue. The sea, to be fair, has never shown much interest in helping us keep our safety guidance entertaining. Then comes the third piece, and this is where modernity enters. We often imagine that science and technology should have ended this whole business by now. Sonar, submersibles, ROVs, genetics, satellite imagery, deep-sea sampling, official reports, high-resolution cameras. Surely these should have forced the strange thing in the water either into a specimen jar or out of existence altogether. Instead, something more awkward happened. Modern research confirmed that the deep really does contain animals odd enough to sound fictional. Smithsonian's 2024 report on Hariota avia, the Australasian narrow-nosed spookfish, describes a newly recognised deep-sea chimera with a thin snout, whip-like tail, and ocean floor habitat more than 1.5 miles down, while also noting how little scientists still know about chimeras despite their lineage stretching back more than 400 million years. Niwa's own release describes its elongated snout, broad pectoral fins, scale-free skin, and beak-like teeth. So the modern ocean did not calm the imagination, it quietly justified it. That is an inconvenient truth for anyone who prefers the world tidy. Some things look mythical because they are fictional. Other things look mythical because real evolution in dark water is under no obligation to respect our preferences. The abyssal chimera, or ghost shark if one prefers the nickname, is a perfect example. It is not a sea monster in the old folkloric sense. It is a documented fish, yet still lands in the mind almost exactly where older sea monsters did, because its body feels assembled from instructions that ought to have been revised before production. That reaction matters. It means that real biology continues to replenish the old reservoir of wonder and unease. We are not merely repeating inherited fears, we are meeting genuine strangeness, and then trying to decide which of our older categories can still hold it. Now add the fourth piece, which is rumour. Modern rumour behaves a little like decomposition. It strips away context, preserves the most dramatic outline, and leaves behind something memorable, but anatomically unreliable. The Russian aquinoid story is a nearly perfect modern case. Lake Baikal is real and extraordinary. UNESCO identifies it as the world's oldest and deepest lake. containing nearly 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater, and modern science uses it for advanced work such as the Baikal GVD neutrino telescope. It is also home to the Baikal seal, the only seal species whose populations all live in freshwater. A place like that does not need much help sounding uncanny, but the famous story of Soviet divers encountering silver-suited underwater humanoids in 1982 has a very weak public source chain. Skeptoid notes that the tale is often said to derive from declassified Soviet files, yet its provenance remains poor and the canonical version is not anchored in a clear, verifiable primary record. That matters because it shows the modern version of the same old process. Earlier cultures attach beings to dangerous waters through oral tradition, ritual, and local memory. Modern culture often attaches beings to dangerous or unusual waters through the theatre of official secrecy. We no longer say only, "Old fishers have always warned about that pass." We say, "There was a classified report," or "military divers saw something," or "the file was declassified but suppressed." The structure is new, the emotional engine is old. Deep water plus partial access plus claimed authority still produces entities that live comfortably between belief and doubt. And then there is the fifth piece, which may be the most important of all. These cases do not all belong to the same category, and trying to force them there actually makes them less interesting. The Taniwha is not just a cryptid. The Makara is not just a misidentified animal. The Isonard is not simply a hidden species waiting for a proper specimen. The Tijeruk is not merely a northern cousin of the sea serpent. The Zuyo Maru carcass is not simply proof of a prehistoric survivor. The giant leptocephalus is not a monster, yet it still generates monster-like speculation. The Baikal swimmer story is not strong evidence, but it is strong folklore in modern uniform. The ghost shark is undeniably real, but it still behaves in culture like something halfway between zoology and rumour. The mistake, then, is not only asking for one answer. It is assuming all the cases are asking the same question. They are not. Some ask what biology looks like when seen incompletely. Some ask how communities remember dangerous places. Some ask how symbol and environment get braided together. Some ask how much of a sighting is body and how much is outline. Some ask what happens when deep water enters the age of bureaucracy and the internet. And some ask a simpler, slightly more uncomfortable question: how much of the world remains structurally difficult for human beings to observe well? That phrase, structurally difficult, is worth keeping. It means the mystery is not an accident caused by a single missing expedition or a single bad witness. It means the environment itself is built in such a way that incomplete knowledge is normal. Deep water is dark. Cold water is dangerous. Under ice environments hide movement. Carcasses decay in misleading ways. Larval stages can look unrelated to adulthood. Local tradition preserves meaning that outsiders flatten into monster stories. Online culture spreads names faster than evidence. None of this is temporary. It is built into the subject. We are not dealing with a puzzle box that has not yet been solved because no one has found the right key. We are dealing with an environment that routinely produces fragments, and fragments invite pattern recognition. That is what human beings do. We collect the giant larva, the strange carcass, the dangerous pass with a guardian, the barbed tail in rough weather, the under-ice devourer, the underwater humanoid rumour, the newly described ghostfish, the cave-riddled cape with a stubborn sea monster story, and we begin to suspect continuity. Sometimes there is continuity in the literal sense. The same kinds of observational problems really do recur, but often the continuity is higher up, not one species, one pattern, a pattern in which the least accessible waters on Earth repeatedly generate beings that are hard to sort because they sit exactly where three things overlap: real environmental danger, real biological strangeness, and human meaning-making. Once you see that, the cases stop competing and start cooperating. The folklore cases do not weaken the biological ones. The biological ones do not erase the symbolic ones. The rumour cases do not cancel the place-based traditions. Together they show that the deep ocean and deep or hidden waters more broadly are not just places where unknown animals might exist. They are places where knowledge itself becomes unstable. Not impossible, just unstable. Enough to let a shark resemble a reptile, a lava imply a giant, a seal hole suggest hidden life, a local guardian become a living dolphin in retelling, a real fish look like a fabricated chimera, and a weakly sourced military story become as durable as old myth. So what if these are not one creature, but one pattern? Then the pattern may be this. Whenever humans face waters that are difficult to observe, costly to enter, rich in genuine life, and already important to survival, memory or belief, they tend to produce entities that are neither wholly invented nor wholly settled. Some are based on animals, some on accidents, some on warnings, some on symbols, some on stories that improve in the telling. But all of them point to the same stubborn fact. The sea, especially where it is deepest, darkest, coldest or hardest to reach, keeps us in the position of partial witness. And perhaps that is the real thing said to lurk in the trenches and under the ice, and beyond the reef, and below the boat. Not one secret species with one perfect name, but a recurring human encounter with a world that refuses to present itself in complete form. The deep keeps giving us evidence without closure, bodies without context, places with memory, and creatures that are sometimes real, sometimes symbolic, sometimes both, and very often impossible to separate cleanly while we are still standing at the edge looking down. That may sound less dramatic than a single hidden beast waiting in the black water. In one sense it is. In another, it is stranger. A single creature could be found, named, measured, and eventually made familiar. A pattern like this does not end so neatly. As long as there are deep waters we barely visit, real animals we still misunderstand, and places whose dangers are remembered through story rather than charts alone, the reports will continue. New names will appear, old ones will return. One case will turn out to be a fish. Another will turn out to be a story doing practical work. Another will remain annoyingly uncertain, and the ocean, with its usual lack of concern for our filing systems, will go on supplying material for all three. So as the water darkens and the last clean categories begin to slip a little, perhaps the most honest answer is not, yes, there is one thing down there, and not, no, there is nothing at all. It is something quieter. There is a pattern down there. There has been for a very long time, and every time human beings meet the least finished parts of the world, the pattern rises with them, dripping, half seen, and just clear enough to make us tell the story again.